The doctor's voice crackled through the phone at 11:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving Eve. Your daughter has severe internal bleeding. We need consent for emergency surgery within 30 minutes, or she won't survive. My mother's response. She laughed. Actually laughed, the sound of champagne glasses clinking in the background. If she dies, call me back. I'm hosting important guests. And my father. He told the hospital I had a history of self-harm, a lie designed to delay my treatment, to let me bleed out on that operating table while they posed for family photos without me. I should have died that night. But when I woke up 3 days later, tubes in my arms and machines beeping around me, I saw something on my medical chart that stopped my heart. Healthcare proxy Ethan Ward. Ethan. The boy next door who vanished from my life 19 years ago. The one person who ever made me feel safe until he disappeared without a word. He signed the papers that saved my life. He paid for everything. He sat outside my surgery for 8 hours while my own parents couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. But here's what I didn't know yet. Ethan wasn't just my childhood protector. He was hiding a secret that would expose every lie my family had told me for 36 years, including the truth about who my real father was. What happens when a family's darkest secrets finally come to light? Stay with me until the end, because this story has 7 twists you'll never see coming. And the ending. It's the justice I waited my whole life for. My name is Camille Stone. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent the last decade working as a social worker in Chicago, helping women escape abusive homes. It's work that breaks your heart daily, but I understand these women in a way most counselors can't, because I grew up in a house where love was conditional, criticism was constant, and I learned very early that some families are prisons disguised as homes. I was 4 hours into the drive back to my hometown when I started questioning every decision that led me to this moment. The highway stretched endlessly before me, gray and wet with the threat of rain, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. 500 miles. That's how far I moved to escape the Stone family, and yet here I was driving back like a dog, returning to the person who kicked it. The call had come 3 days ago. Not an invitation my mother never invited. She demanded, "Camille, you need to be here for Thanksgiving." Her voice had that sharp edge I'd learned to recognize in childhood, the one that meant disobedience would be punished. People in town keep asking why you never visit. Do you have any idea how that makes us look? Your father had to tell the Hendersons that you were busy with work. Again. I'd wanted to say no. God, how I wanted to say no. I had a perfectly good excuse. My caseload was overwhelming, and one of my clients was in a particularly fragile state. But 36 years of conditioning doesn't disappear just because you move away. The guilt rose up in my throat before I could stop it, and I heard myself agreeing before my brain caught up with my mouth. Fine, I'll come, but I'm leaving Friday morning. My mother didn't thank me. She simply said, "Try to look presentable this time," and hung up. That conversation played on repeat in my mind as the miles rolled by. Try to look presentable. As if I were a problem to be managed, rather than a daughter to be welcomed. But that had always been my role in the Stone household. The inconvenient one, the difficult one, the one who never quite measured up to my younger sister Clarissa's golden perfection. I wasn't really going home for them, though. I was going for Grandma Eleanor. It had been 5 years since she passed, and I still visited her grave every Thanksgiving. She was buried in the old cemetery on the edge of town beneath a maple tree that turned brilliant red every autumn. I would bring flowers, yellow roses her favorite, and sit on the cold ground and talk to her headstone as if she could hear me. Maybe she could. I liked to believe she could. Grandma Eleanor was the only person in that family who ever made me feel like I mattered. While my parents lavished attention on Clarissa, praise for her grades, pride in her beauty, celebration of her every small achievement, I was the shadow in the corner, noticed only when I did something wrong. But Grandma saw me. She really saw me. I remember Thanksgiving when I was 8 years old. My mother had seated me at the far end of the table, practically in the kitchen doorway, while Clarissa sat at my father's right hand like a little princess. The turkey was carved and passed around, and somehow my plate ended up with the smallest portion and the driest pieces. I didn't complain. I'd learned by then that complaining only made things worse, but I remember staring at my plate and feeling something heavy settle in my chest. Then Grandma Eleanor appeared beside me with a plate of her famous pecan pie. "This piece is for you," she whispered, pressing it into my hands. "I made it special just how you like it. Extra pecans." She kissed the top of my head and added so quietly only I could hear, "You are my treasure, Camille. Don't you ever forget that." I never did forget. Those words became a lifeline I clung to through every cold holiday, every ignored birthday, every moment when my parents looked right through me as if I were made of glass. The memory made my eyes sting, and I blinked rapidly to clear my vision. The highway was getting darker now, clouds gathering overhead like a warning. My weather app had predicted rain, and it looked like the prediction was about to come true. I thought about what awaited me in that town. My parents' house, where I'd have to endure 2 days of subtle insults and not-so-subtle comparisons to Clarissa. My childhood bedroom stripped of everything personal years ago and converted into a guest room that felt like it belonged to a stranger. The pitying looks from neighbors who remembered me as the quiet stone girl and probably wondered what went wrong with me while Clarissa turned out so perfect. And then there was Clarissa herself. My sister and I hadn't spoken in over a year. The last time was at a family event where she'd casually mentioned that our parents were worried about me living alone, that maybe I should consider moving back home where they could keep an eye on me. I'd recognized the manipulation immediately Clarissa had learned from the masters, but it still hurt. It always hurt. I told myself this was the last time. After this visit, I would stop coming back. I would send flowers to Grandma's grave instead of delivering them personally. I would stop answering my mother's calls. I would finally completely cut the cord that kept dragging me back into their orbit. But even as I made that promise to myself, I knew it was probably a lie. The hooks they'd planted in me went deep. 36 years deep. The rain started just as I crossed the county line. Fat drops splattered against my windshield, and I switched on my wipers, squinting at the road ahead. Visibility was dropping fast. I should probably find somewhere to pull over and wait out the worst of it. That's when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. A black SUV, maybe 50 feet behind me. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. There were always other cars on the highway, but now something about it made my skin prickle. I slowed down slightly, expecting it to pass me. It didn't pass. It slowed down too, maintaining that exact distance. I changed lanes. The SUV changed lanes. My heart began to beat a little faster. I was probably being paranoid. It was just another driver heading the same direction, that's all. Coincidence. But I'd been working with victims of stalking and domestic abuse for 10 years, and if there's one thing I'd learned, it's that women who ignore their instincts often end up regretting it. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb. 65. 70. 75. The SUV matched my speed exactly. 20 miles. I realized with a chill that ran down my spine that I'd first noticed those headlights about 20 miles ago. 20 miles of being followed, and I'd only just now become aware of it. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the highway into a river of reflected taillights and blurred lane markers. I couldn't see the driver of the SUV through the downpour, couldn't even make out the license plate. Just that dark shape behind me, keeping pace, maintaining distance, watching, waiting. I reached for my phone with one trembling hand, ready to call 911, when the SUV's headlights suddenly grew brighter in my mirror. It was accelerating. The SUV's headlights grew larger in my mirror with terrifying speed, twin beams cutting through the rain like predators' eyes locked onto prey. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor, but my sedan was no match for whatever engine powered that dark machine behind me. 80 miles per hour. 85. The rain hammered against my windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up, and the road ahead became a blur of black and silver and the ghostly glow of distant taillights. I had maybe 3 seconds to react when the SUV swerved into the left lane and accelerated alongside me. For one desperate moment I thought they were finally going to pass, that this had all been my imagination running wild, just an impatient driver in a hurry to get somewhere. But then the SUV cut sharply to the right directly into my lane, so close I could have reached out and touched its black metal hide. I yanked the steering wheel to avoid the collision. It was pure instinct, no thought involved, just the animal reflex to survive. But at 85 miles per hour on a rain-slicked highway, instinct became my enemy. The moment my tires hit the water pooled along the shoulder, I lost control completely. The car began to spin a sickening rotation that pressed me against my door with centrifugal force. Through the whirling chaos of my windshield, I saw the guardrail rushing toward me like a silver wall of inevitability. The impact was catastrophic. Metal screamed against metal as my car slammed into the guardrail at an angle. And then I was airborne, the world outside my windows becoming a tumbling kaleidoscope of sky and asphalt and rain. The car flipped once, twice, 3 times. I lost count as my body was thrown against the seatbelt, the door, the steering wheel. Glass exploded inward, showering me with 1,000 tiny diamonds that bit into my skin. Something wet and warm ran down my face, and I tasted copper on my tongue. When the car finally stopped moving, I was upside down, suspended by my seatbelt in a cocoon of crushed metal and shattered glass. The engine made a dying sound, a mechanical groan that faded into silence. Rain poured in through the broken windows, mixing with the blood dripping from my forehead into my eyes. And beneath it all, cutting through the shock and the pain, I smelled gasoline. Sharp and unmistakable. A death sentence waiting for a spark. I tried to move to reach for the seatbelt release, but my arms wouldn't cooperate. Everything hurt in ways I couldn't categorize: sharp pain, dull pain, burning pain, pain that radiated outward from my abdomen like something inside me had ruptured. I opened my mouth to scream for help, but only a wet gurgle emerged. Something was very wrong inside my body. Something was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed with bandages and rest. Through the cracked remains of my driver's side window, I saw headlights. The SUV had stopped about 30 feet away, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically in the rain. As I watched through a haze of blood and agony, the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. Hope flickered in my chest despite everything. They were coming to help. They were going to call 911. I wasn't going to die alone in this twisted metal coffin on the side of a highway 5 hours from anyone who might miss me. But the figure didn't approach. They stood beside their vehicle, rain streaming down around them, and simply watched. I couldn't see their face. The blood in my eyes, the darkness, the distance all conspired to keep them anonymous. But I could feel their gaze on me like a physical weight. They were watching me die. Watching and doing nothing. I tried to call out, to beg, to demand they help me, but my voice had abandoned me completely. All I could do was stare back at that dark silhouette, trying desperately to make out any identifying feature. There was something about the way they stood, something about the angle of their shoulders and the tilt of their head that tugged at a distant memory. Something familiar. Something that made no sense in this moment of chaos and terror. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the figure turned and walked back to the SUV. The door closed. The hazard light stopped, and then the black vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the rain, and the night leaving me alone with the smell of gasoline and the growing certainty that I was going to die. The world began to fade at the edges, darkness creeping in from my peripheral vision like a slow tide. I thought about Grandma Eleanor waiting for me in that cemetery I would never reach. I thought about the yellow roses sitting in a vase on my kitchen counter back in Chicago, already starting to wilt because I'd bought them too early. I thought about my clients, the women who depended on me to help them escape their own prisons, and wondered who would take over their cases. I thought about all the things I'd never said, never done, never become. I didn't think about my parents at all. The sound of sirens pulled me back from the edge of unconsciousness. Red and blue lights painted the rain in strobing patterns, and suddenly there were voices everywhere, urgent and professional, cutting through the night with the efficiency of people trained to save lives. I felt hands on me, felt the pressure of the seatbelt release, felt myself being lowered and lifted and strapped onto something flat and firm. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Ma'am, stay with us." I tried to respond, but the darkness kept pulling at me, dragging me under like an undertow. Fragments of conversation drifted through my fading awareness, disconnected words that painted a picture I didn't want to see. Severe internal bleeding, abdomen is rigid, BP dropping fast. "We need to move now. She's not going to make it if we don't get her into surgery. Find her emergency contact. Check her phone." I felt movement, the jolting rhythm of a gurney being loaded into an ambulance. Someone was going through my purse, my phone, searching for the numbers that would determine whether I lived or died. I wanted to tell them not to bother calling my parents, that they wouldn't come, that they probably wouldn't even care. But my mouth wouldn't form the words, and my eyes wouldn't stay open. The last thing I heard before consciousness abandoned me completely was a young paramedic's voice reading from my phone's contact list. "Got it. Mom, Dad, and someone named Ethan marked as emergency only. Who should we try first?" An older voice answered, calm and authoritative. "Parents first. That's protocol." And then a doctor's voice somewhere close but somehow very far away. "Call her parents now. We need consent for surgery within 30 minutes or she won't survive." The trauma unit at Mercy General Hospital had seen its share of emergencies, but Nurse Rebecca Chen would later tell her colleagues that Thanksgiving Eve of that year changed how she thought about family forever. She stood at the nurse's station, Camille Stone's cracked phone in her trembling hand, and prepared to make the calls that should have been simple. Parents notified, consent obtained, surgery performed, life saved. That was how it was supposed to work. The number labeled Mom connected on the third ring. In the background, Rebecca could hear the unmistakable sounds of a party in full swing, glasses, clinking laughter echoing off high ceilings. The murmur of sophisticated conversation punctuated by bursts of social merriment. Whoever these people were, they were having the Thanksgiving Eve celebration of the season. "Hello?" A woman's voice, cultured and cold, cut through the ambient noise. "Who is this? I don't recognize the number." "Mrs. Stone. Mrs. Patricia Stone." Rebecca kept her voice professionally calm despite the urgency screaming in her chest. "This is Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Camille. She's been in a serious car accident and an accident." The word came out flat without a trace of maternal panic. In Rebecca's experience, parents who received these calls either screamed or went silent with shock. Patricia Stone did neither. She sounded annoyed, as if someone had called to inform her of an overdue library book. "How serious is she dead?" Rebecca blinked, certain she had misheard. "No, ma'am, she's not dead, but she's in critical condition. She has severe internal bleeding and requires emergency surgery. We need your consent to—" "If she's not dead, why are you calling me in the middle of my party?" Patricia's voice sharpened with irritation. "I have important guests here, people who actually matter. The Hendersons are here. The mayor's wife is here. I can't simply drop everything because Camille decided to get into some kind of accident. Mrs. Stone, your daughter could die without this surgery. We need authorization to proceed, and as her next of kin. If she dies, call me back. I'll deal with the arrangements then." There was a pause, and Rebecca heard someone in the background asking Patricia who was on the phone. "No one important," Patricia responded, her voice moving away from the receiver. "Just some hospital nonsense about Camille. You know how she is always creating drama." "Mrs. Stone, please, I need you to understand the severity." The line went dead. Patricia Stone had hung up on her dying daughter without so much as asking which hospital she was in. Rebecca stared at the phone in her hand, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. In 12 years of nursing, she had delivered death notifications, held the hands of grieving parents, witnessed every possible human response to tragedy. But she had never encountered a mother who responded to her child's potential death with such calculated indifference. Dr. Martinez appeared at her elbow, his surgical scrubs already on his face tight with urgency. "Did you reach the parents? We're running out of time. Her blood pressure is dropping and I need to get in there now." "The mother, she hung up on me." Rebecca could barely form the words. "She said to call back if Camille dies. She said she has important guests." Dr. Martinez's expression shifted from urgency to disbelief. "Try the father. Maybe he'll be more responsive." The number labeled Dad answered on the second ring. Richard Stone's voice was deeper than his wife's, with the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The party sounds were fainter in his background, suggesting he had stepped away from the main gathering to take the call. "This is Richard Stone. What is this regarding?" Rebecca went through the explanation again, forcing herself to remain professional despite the clock ticking down her patient's life. Car accident, internal bleeding, emergency surgery, consent needed immediately. Richard Stone listened without interruption, then asked a question that made Rebecca's stomach turn. "Was alcohol involved? I need to know before this goes any further. The Stone name cannot be associated with any kind of scandal, especially not a drunk driving incident." "Sir, your daughter wasn't driving drunk. She was hit by another vehicle, but that's not important right now. What's important is that she needs surgery within the next 15 minutes or—" "Do what you need to do," Richard interrupted, his tone suggesting he was discussing an inconvenient business matter rather than his child's life. "But I should mention, and I tell you this only because it's relevant to her treatment, Camille has a history of self-harm, attention-seeking behavior. You might want to verify that this accident was actually an accident before you go cutting her open. She's manipulative that way." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir, I can assure you this was a genuine car accident. Multiple witnesses saw—" "I've said what I needed to say. Don't call this number again tonight. We're entertaining, and my wife is already upset about being disturbed." The line clicked, and Richard Stone was gone. Rebecca turned to Dr. Martinez, her professional composure finally cracking. "He said she has a history of self-harm. He suggested this might have been intentional. He told us to verify before proceeding." Dr. Martinez closed his eyes, and Rebecca saw the conflict playing across his face. Hospital protocol was clear. Any suggestion of self-harm required psychiatric evaluation before surgery to ensure proper treatment planning and post-operative care. It was a rule designed to protect patients, but in this case, following it could cost Camille Stone her life. "How long would psychiatric evaluation take?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. "Longer than she has." Dr. Martinez looked toward the trauma bay where Camille lay unconscious, her vital signs deteriorating by the minute. "But if we proceed without authorization and something goes wrong, the hospital's liability—" "She's going to die." Rebecca's voice broke. "Her own parents just sentenced her to death, and we're going to let it happen because of protocol." The seconds stretched into an eternity. Other nurses had gathered now, all of them wearing the same expression of horror and helplessness. They had dedicated their lives to saving people, and here they stood, hands tied by the very rules meant to protect their patients. Then Rebecca remembered. There was a third contact in Camille's phone, a name she had barely glanced at when scanning for family members, dismissed because it didn't say husband or brother, or anything that indicated immediate family. She pulled up the contact list again, her fingers shaking. There it was, sitting below the parents who had just abandoned their daughter to die. Ethan, emergency only. Emergency only. Camille had put those words there for a reason. She had known somehow that someday she might need someone other than her parents to save her life. Rebecca dialed the number and pressed the phone to her ear, listening to it ring once, twice, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Please answer," she prayed silently. Please be someone who cares whether this woman lives or dies. The phone rang twice before a man's voice answered alert despite the late hour, as if he had been waiting for exactly this kind of call. "This is Ethan Ward." Rebecca gripped the phone tighter, aware that every second she spent talking was a second Camille Stone didn't have. "Mr. Ward, this is Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling about Camille Stone. She's been in a serious car accident and is in critical condition. Your number was listed in her phone as an emergency contact, and we've been unable to obtain consent from her parents for life-saving surgery. I know this is unusual, but I need to ask if you have any legal authority to—" "I'm her healthcare proxy." The words came out steel calm without a moment's hesitation. "The documentation is on file with the Illinois State Registry and should be accessible through your hospital's legal department. Eleanor Mitchell designated me in 2005. I authorize all necessary procedures. Do whatever you need to do to save her life. I'm 3 hours away, but I'll be there before she wakes up." Rebecca felt tears of relief prick her eyes. "Mr. Ward, I need to verify." "Check the registry. My full name is Ethan James Ward, date of birth March 15, 1983. The proxy document number is IL 2005-7749. Now please stop talking to me and start saving her." There was no anger in his voice, only urgent command. "Is there anything else you need from me verbally before I get in my car?" "No, sir. We'll verify and proceed immediately." "Good. And nurse—" His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Don't bother trying her parents again. They won't help. They never have." The line disconnected, and Rebecca was already moving, shouting for Dr. Martinez, pulling up the state healthcare proxy registry on the nearest computer. The documentation was there exactly as Ethan Ward had described, filed 19 years ago by Eleanor Mitchell, grandmother of Camille Stone, designating Ethan James Ward as the sole individual authorized to make medical decisions on Camille's behalf should she become incapacitated. The paperwork was meticulous, legally airtight, and clearly prepared by someone who had anticipated exactly this nightmare scenario. Camille Stone's own grandmother had known nearly 2 decades ago that her granddaughter's parents could not be trusted to save her life. 300 miles away, Ethan Ward grabbed his keys and was out the door of his apartment within 90 seconds of hanging up the phone. His go-bag was already packed. It had been packed for years, ready for the call he always knew might come. As he merged onto the highway and pushed his truck well past the speed limit, he thought about the 2 promises that had shaped the last 19 years of his life. The first promise was to Eleanor Mitchell, made in the summer of 2005 when he was barely 22 years old. She had found him working at the hardware store in town, approached him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, and asked if he remembered the little girl next door. The quiet one with the sad eyes who used to sit on her porch and read while her sister played with friends in the yard. Of course he remembered Camille. He had taught her to ride a bike. He had chased away the older kids who called her names. He had sat with her on countless summer evenings while her parents' arguments echoed from inside the house, never asking her to talk, just letting her know she wasn't alone. "I'm dying," Eleanor had told him that day, her voice matter-of-fact, despite the weight of the words. "Cancer. I have maybe a year left, probably less. And I need someone to watch over Camille when I'm gone. Her parents—" She had paused, her jaw tightening with barely contained fury. "Her parents will destroy her if given the chance. I've done what I can legally to protect her inheritance, but I need someone who will protect her. Someone who actually cares whether she lives or dies." Ethan had agreed without hesitation. Eleanor had made him Camille's healthcare proxy, had given him copies of all the legal documents he might need, had trusted him with secrets about the Stone family that made his blood run cold. A week later, he received his orders to deploy overseas with his army unit. He had written Camille a letter explaining that he had to leave, but that he would always be watching out for her. He never knew if she received it. Based on how her parents operated, probably not. The second promise was to James Porter, the man who had saved Ethan's life in a field hospital in Afghanistan, and then impossibly had become his father in every way that mattered. James had adopted Ethan when he was just 6 years old, a traumatized orphan from a war-torn region who spoke no English and trusted no one. James had been patient, kind, endlessly loving, everything Ethan's biological parents had not been. He had given Ethan a home, an education, a sense of purpose. But James carried a wound that never healed. 36 years ago, the woman he loved had been forced to leave him, and he had been told that their child, a daughter, had died at birth. He had mourned that baby girl for decades, channeling his grief into his work as a military doctor, saving other people's children because he couldn't save his own. Then 5 years ago, everything changed. Eleanor Mitchell, dying and desperate to make amends, had tracked James down and told him the truth. His daughter hadn't died. She was alive, grown, suffering under the cruelty of the family that had stolen her from him. Her name was Camille Stone. Ethan remembered the look on his adoptive father's face when he learned the news, joy and rage and heartbreak all tangled together, 36 years of grief suddenly transformed into desperate hope. James had wanted to find Camille immediately to introduce himself to reclaim the relationship that had been stolen from them both. But the Stone family had connections, money power. They had threatened James with restraining orders, defamation lawsuits, accusations of stalking. A retired military doctor living on a pension couldn't fight that kind of legal warfare. So James had asked Ethan to watch over Camille from a distance, to wait for the right moment to intervene, to be ready when she needed help that her so-called family would never provide. For 5 years, Ethan had done exactly that, keeping tabs on Camille through careful, unobtrusive means, making sure she was safe without revealing himself, waiting for the call that had finally come tonight. The 3-hour drive passed in a blur of dark highway and desperate prayer. Ethan arrived at Mercy General just as the surgical team was wheeling Camille into recovery, her vital signs stable, her life saved by the margin of minutes. He collapsed into a chair in the hallway outside her room, exhausted beyond measure, but unwilling to leave until he saw her open her eyes. A nurse approached him sometime later, clipboard in hand, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like awe. "Mr. Ward, I'm updating the patient's file. Could you tell me your relationship to Ms. Stone?" Ethan looked up at her, then through the window at Camille's unconscious form, pale and broken, but alive. He thought about blood relations that meant nothing and chosen bonds that meant everything. He thought about Eleanor's trust, James's hope, and his own 19 years of patient vigilance. "I'm the only family she has," he said quietly. "The only family that matters anyway." The nurse nodded slowly, making a note on her clipboard. Later, when the records were fully updated, she would show them to her colleague, the documentation that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Healthcare proxy Ethan Ward, the file read. Designated by Eleanor Mitchell, 2005. The colleague stared at the screen, then back at the man keeping vigil outside Camille Stone's room. "Her own grandmother knew," she whispered. 19 years ago, she knew the parents couldn't be trusted to save their own daughter's life. Consciousness returned in fragments like shards of a broken mirror, slowly reassembling themselves into a recognizable image. First came the pain, a deep throbbing ache that radiated from my abdomen and seemed to touch every nerve ending in my body. Then came the sounds, the steady beep of a heart monitor, the mechanical whisper of machines breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, the soft footsteps of nurses moving through corridors designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Finally, the smells antiseptic and industrial cleaning solution, and something metallic that I realized with a distant horror was probably my own blood. I opened my eyes to fluorescent lights and white ceiling tiles, my vision blurry and uncertain. Tubes snaked from my arms connected to bags of fluid hanging from metal poles. A monitor beside my bed displayed numbers that meant nothing to me. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, all the clinical measurements of a life nearly lost. I tried to move to sit up to understand where I was and how I had gotten here, but my body refused to cooperate. Every muscle felt weighted down, every joint locked in place by invisible restraints. The crash. The memory slammed into me with almost physical force. The black SUV, the rain, the spinning, tumbling nightmare of metal and glass. And then the figure. Standing in the downpour, watching me trapped in the wreckage, making no move to help before disappearing into the night. Someone had watched me dying and chosen to walk away. But I wasn't dead. Somehow impossibly, I was alive. A nurse appeared at my bedside, her face kind but tired, the face of someone nearing the end of a long shift. "Ms. Stone, you're awake. That's good. Very good. You gave us quite a scare." She checked the monitors, made notes on a tablet, her movements practiced and efficient. "You've been out for almost 2 days. The surgery went well, but you lost a lot of blood. You're going to be here for a while." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper wrapped around broken glass. The nurse noticed my struggle and brought a cup of water with a straw, holding it to my lips. The cool liquid was the most wonderful thing I had ever tasted. "My parents," I managed to croak. "Did anyone call my parents?" Something flickered across the nurse's face, an expression she quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough for me to miss. It looked like anger or perhaps disgust, emotions that seemed out of place in a medical professional discussing a patient's family. "We contacted them," she said carefully, her tone neutral in a way that felt deliberately controlled. "But your healthcare proxy handled everything. He authorized the surgery that saved your life." Healthcare proxy. The words didn't make sense. I didn't have a healthcare proxy. I had never designated anyone to make medical decisions for me because I had never imagined a scenario where I would need one. I was 36 years old, healthy, independent. These were not things I thought about. "There must be a mistake," I said. "I don't have a proxy." The nurse consulted her tablet, then turned the screen so I could see it. "According to our records, your healthcare proxy was designated in 2005 by Eleanor Mitchell, your maternal grandmother. The proxy's name is Ethan Ward." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Ethan Ward. The name hit me like a second car crash, sending my already fractured thoughts spinning into chaos. Ethan. The boy next door who had lived 3 houses down from my family home, whose backyard connected to ours through a gap in the fence that we had used as our own private passage between worlds. Ethan, who had taught me to ride a bicycle when I was 7 because my father couldn't be bothered. Ethan, who had once punched Tommy Garrison in the nose for calling me ugly, then walked me home with a bloody hand and a satisfied grin. Ethan, who had sat beside me on countless summer evenings while my parents screamed at each other inside the house. Never asking questions, never offering empty platitudes, just being there in the solid, reliable way that no one else in my life had ever managed. Ethan, who had vanished without a word when I was 17 years old and had never contacted me again. The memories came flooding back now, unstoppable, unwanted. I remembered the day I realized he was gone, knocking on his door after school and finding strangers living there, people who knew nothing about the previous tenant or where he might have moved. I remembered asking my mother about him and receiving only a sharp look and sharper words. "That boy was trouble. I told you to stay away from him. It's better that he's gone." I remembered believing for a long time that she was right. That Ethan had abandoned me just like everyone else eventually did. That I had been foolish to trust anyone, even him. And now his name was on my medical file, listed as the person who had saved my life when my own parents wouldn't. "I don't understand," I whispered. "How is this possible? I didn't know about any of this. My grandmother never told me." The nurse's expression softened with something that looked like compassion. "I don't know the details of your family situation, Ms. Stone, and it's not my place to ask. But I can tell you this: when we couldn't reach your parents, when the situation was desperate, and we were running out of options." Ethan Ward answered his phone on the second ring. "He authorized your surgery without hesitation. He drove 3 hours through the night to be here. He paid for everything your insurance didn't cover without being asked." She paused, her voice gentling further. "He sat outside the operating room for 8 hours, refusing to leave, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. In 12 years of nursing, I've never seen anyone more worried about a patient. Whatever happened between you two, whatever your history is, that man cares about you in a way I rarely see from actual family members. I stared at the ceiling, trying to process information that refused to fit into any framework I understood. Grandma Eleanor had made Ethan my healthcare proxy without telling me. She had trusted him with my life, with decisions about my body, with power that should have belonged to my parents. And she had done it 19 years ago, right around the time Ethan disappeared. What had she known? What had she seen coming that I had been too young, too naive, too desperate for parental love to recognize? The door to my room opened, and my heart stopped. He was older now, of course. 36 years had passed since the summer he taught me to ride that bike, 19 since he vanished from my life without explanation. His shoulders were broader, his face more weathered, his dark hair touched with early gray at the temples. But his eyes were the same, that steady, warm brown that had always made me feel anchored when everything else was chaos. Ethan Ward stood in the doorway looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, and for the first time in 19 years, we were face to face. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Ethan stood in the doorway as if waiting for permission to enter, his broad shoulders tense beneath a wrinkled flannel shirt that looked like it had been slept in. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and stubble covered his jaw, the appearance of a man who had been awake for far too long, sustained by nothing but coffee and worry. Behind him, the nurse quietly slipped out, closing the door with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. 19 years. That's how long it had been since I last saw this man. I had been 17, a junior in high school, still naive enough to believe that people who cared about you didn't just disappear without explanation. I had knocked on his door for weeks after he vanished, walked past his empty house on my way to school, checked the mailbox for letters that never came. Eventually, I stopped hoping. I added his name to the list of people who had failed me and moved on with my life. And now here he was, standing in my hospital room, looking at me with eyes that held 19 years of unspoken words. Camille. His voice was deeper than I remembered, roughened by time and experience, but it still carried that same gentle steadiness that had once made me feel safe. He moved slowly toward the chair beside my bed, as if approaching a wounded animal that might startle and bolt. I'm sorry I disappeared. I wanted to explain, but I couldn't. Not then. I wanted to be angry. I had spent years being angry, nursing the wound of his abandonment alongside all the other wounds my family had inflicted. I had constructed elaborate fantasies of what I would say if I ever saw him again. Accusations, demands for explanation, cutting remarks designed to make him feel even a fraction of the hurt his leaving had caused. But looking at him now, older and weathered, but still somehow the same steady presence I remembered from childhood summers, all those rehearsed words evaporated like morning dew. Why are you here? The question came out smaller than I intended, almost plaintive. I hated how vulnerable I sounded, how much I still needed answers from someone who had let me down 2 decades ago. Ethan sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support the weight he was carrying. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I'm here because your grandmother asked me to be. 19 years ago, she made me promise that if anything ever happened to you, I would be there. She knew. He paused, his jaw tightening. She knew your parents would never protect you. She knew that someday you might need someone who actually cared whether you lived or died. So she asked me, and I said yes. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread outward into every corner of my understanding. Grandma Eleanor had known. She had seen what I was too young to recognize, too hopeful to accept. She had looked at her own daughter and son-in-law and understood with the clear-eyed wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to stop making excuses for cruelty that they would let me die if it suited their purposes. The healthcare proxy, I said slowly, piecing together the fragments. She made you my proxy in 2005, right before you left. Ethan nodded. I got my deployment orders that summer. I was shipping out with an army unit to Afghanistan, and I didn't know if I'd be coming back. Your grandmother found me at the hardware store where I was working and told me she needed my help. She said she was putting legal protections in place for you, things that would matter when she was gone. She asked if I would accept the responsibility of making medical decisions for you if you ever couldn't make them yourself. I tried to imagine that conversation, my elegant, fierce grandmother confronting a 22-year-old kid and asking him to shoulder a burden that should have belonged to family. And you just said yes. Just like that, you barely knew me. I knew you well enough. His voice dropped lower, thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. I knew you spent more time reading alone on your porch than playing with other kids. I knew you flinched when your father raised his voice. I knew your mother looked at you differently than she looked at your sister, like you were something she wanted to scrape off her shoe. I knew your grandmother was the only person in that house who treated you like you mattered. He met my eyes directly. I knew enough to understand that saying no wasn't an option. There was more he wasn't telling me. I could see it in the way his gaze flickered away when I tried to hold it too long in the tension that ran through his shoulders like a current waiting to discharge. The healthcare proxy explained why he had been able to authorize my surgery, but it didn't explain everything. It didn't explain 19 years of silence, or why he had disappeared so suddenly, or what my grandmother had really known about my family. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Before you left. Why didn't you say goodbye, explain what was happening? I thought you just abandoned me like everyone else. Pain flashed across his face there and gone in an instant. I tried. I wrote you a letter explaining everything, the deployment, the promise to your grandmother, why I had to go. I left it with your mother to give to you. He let out a bitter laugh. I'm guessing you never received it. Of course I hadn't. Of course my mother had intercepted it. Destroyed it, used Ethan's disappearance as yet another way to isolate me, to convince me that no one outside the family could be trusted. The manipulation was so perfectly in character that I almost laughed too, a dark, hollow sound that caught in my damaged throat. There's more, isn't there? I pressed. Something you're not telling me. Something about why you really accepted this responsibility, why you've apparently been watching over me for 19 years, without ever making contact. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, as if he were navigating a minefield of truths he wasn't yet ready to reveal. I owe your grandmother everything, and I owe you an explanation that I can't give yet. The timing isn't right, and you've been through too much in the last 48 hours to process what I need to tell you. Just know this, Camille, I never abandoned you. Even when you couldn't see me, even when you thought I was gone, I was always watching. Always making sure you were okay. Always waiting for the moment when you might need me. There was something in his voice, a weight, a gravity that went beyond friendship or even familial duty. A secret heavier than the proxy, heavier than the promise. I wanted to push to demand answers, but exhaustion was pulling at me, and the pain medication was making my thoughts fuzzy around the edges. Ethan seemed to sense my fading energy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his expression hardening into something colder, angrier than I had seen from him before. Before you rest, there's something you need to hear, he said. The hospital recorded the calls they made trying to reach your parents. I asked them for copies. He pulled up an audio file and held the phone where I could see the screen. This is what your mother and father said when they were told you were dying. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands, as if it contained something far more substantial than circuits and glass. Ethan had positioned himself at the edge of his chair, watching me with an expression that mixed concern with something harder, a controlled anger that I sensed wasn't directed at me. He reached over and pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the hospital room, cutting through the beeping monitors and humming machines like a blade through silk. Hello, who is this? I don't recognize the number. A nurse's voice, professional but urgent, explained the situation. Accident, critical condition, emergency surgery required consent, needed immediately. I listened to this stranger advocate for my life with more passion than my own mother had ever shown, and something inside me began to crack. An accident. My mother's voice carried no trace of maternal fear. No sharp intake of breath, no trembling worry, no desperate need to know if her child was okay. Instead, there was only irritation, the same tone she used when the dry cleaner lost a blouse or the gardener trimmed the hedges incorrectly. How serious is she dead? The nurse's shocked pause was audible even through the recording. She tried to explain the severity, tried to convey that her patient, who was also someone's daughter, was bleeding internally and might not survive the hour without intervention. But my mother was already talking over her. If she's not dead, why are you calling me in the middle of my party? I have important guests here, people who actually matter. A tinkling laugh in the background, the clink of champagne glasses, the murmur of sophisticated conversation. If she dies, call me back. I'll deal with the arrangements then. The line went dead. My mother had hung up while the nurse was still mid-sentence, still trying to explain that her daughter's life hung in the balance. Important guests. People who actually matter. The words echoed in my skull, each one a hammer blow against whatever remaining illusions I had clung to about my place in my family. The recording continued. A different call now to the number labeled Dad. My father's voice was deeper, more measured, but no warmer. He listened to the same explanation my mother had dismissed, and when he finally spoke, his first concern wasn't whether I was in pain or frightened or alone. Was alcohol involved? I need to know before this goes any further. The Stone name cannot be associated with any kind of scandal. The nurse assured him I hadn't been drinking, that I was the victim of another driver's recklessness, that none of this was my fault. My father sighed. Actually sighed as if my near-death experience was an inconvenient interruption to his evening. Do what you need to do, but don't call this number again tonight. We're entertaining. I thought that was the worst of it. I thought hearing my parents dismiss my potential death as a social inconvenience was the bottom of this particular well of cruelty. I was wrong. I should mention, my father continued, his voice dropping into a tone of false concern, that I recognized immediately the voice he used when lying to business associates, when manipulating situations to his advantage. Camille has a history of self-harm, attention-seeking behavior. You might want to verify that this accident was actually an accident before you go cutting her open. She's manipulative that way. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady beep of my heart monitor, proof that I was still alive despite my father's best efforts to ensure otherwise. I had never harmed myself. Never. Not once in 36 years had I engaged in any form of self-destructive behavior beyond the occasional glass of wine after a hard day. My father knew this. He knew it, and he lied anyway. He invented a psychiatric history designed specifically to create doubt, to cause delay, to give the hospital pause at the exact moment when hesitation could have killed me. My father had tried to let me die by bureaucratic suffocation, wrapping his murder attempt in medical protocol and plausible deniability. I sat there holding Ethan's phone, staring at the black screen as the full weight of what I had just heard settled onto my chest like a physical burden. 36 years. I had spent 36 years trying to understand what I had done wrong, what fundamental flaw in my character made me unworthy of my parents' love. I had studied harder than Clarissa behaved, better than Clarissa demanded less and given more, and shrunk myself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into the tiny space they seemed willing to allocate for my existence. I had skipped meals as a child, convinced that if I ate less, cost less, took up less space, maybe they would finally see me as something other than a burden. I had chosen a career helping abuse victims because some part of me recognized the patterns in my own childhood, but couldn't admit what that recognition meant. I had spent decades in therapy trying to unpack why I felt worthless, never quite arriving at the obvious answer, because the obvious answer was too painful to accept. The answer was that I had never done anything wrong. There was no mistake to fix, no flaw to correct, no magic combination of good behavior that would unlock my parents' hearts. They had simply decided, for reasons I might never fully understand, that I was not worthy of love. Not because of who I was, but because of who they were. The tears came then, but they weren't the tears I expected. They weren't the hot, angry tears of betrayal or the desperate tears of grief. They were something quieter, something almost peaceful, the release of a burden I had carried so long I had forgotten it wasn't part of me. I cried for the little girl who had eaten smaller portions hoping to earn affection. I cried for the teenager who had interpreted Ethan's disappearance as more evidence of her own unworthiness. I cried for the woman who had built a life helping others escape abuse, while never fully acknowledging she had escaped it herself. And somewhere beneath the tears, something else was growing. Something harder, colder, more resolute. My parents hadn't just failed to love me. They had actively chosen my suffering, and when the opportunity arose to let me die without getting their hands dirty, they had taken it without hesitation. Ethan waited until my tears had slowed, his hand resting gently on mine, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but edged with steel. "There's more," he said. "Your father's lie about self-harm, it wasn't spontaneous. That specific phrase, that exact framing, it's designed to trigger mandatory psychiatric evaluation protocols to create exactly the kind of delay that almost killed you. Someone taught him what to say. Someone who understood hospital procedures well enough to weaponize them." He paused, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Someone who wanted you gone, Camille. And I think I know who." My mind was still reeling from the implications of what Ethan had said. Someone had coached my father. Someone who understood exactly how to weaponize hospital protocols against me, when a different memory surfaced unbidden from the depths of my childhood. It rose up like a bubble from deep water, a moment I had buried so thoroughly that I had almost convinced myself it never happened. I was 10 years old, and Clarissa had just performed in her spring piano recital. She had played a complicated Chopin piece, her small fingers dancing across the keys with the precision our mother demanded of everything she did. To my untrained ear, it had sounded beautiful, better than anything I could have accomplished, certainly. But when we got home, our mother had pulled Clarissa into the study and closed the door, and even from the hallway I could hear the sharp edge of her disappointment cutting through the wood. "You hesitated in the third movement. Everyone noticed. Do you have any idea how that reflected on this family? Mrs. Henderson's daughter played flawlessly, and you made us look foolish." I had crept upstairs away from the toxic cloud of criticism seeping from beneath that door and found myself standing outside Clarissa's bedroom an hour later. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see my sister. My perfect, golden, beloved sister, curled up on her bed, sobbing into her pillow with the desperate, broken sound of someone who had been hollowed out from the inside. Something had shifted in my chest at that moment, some instinct toward sisterhood that our parents' constant comparison had almost extinguished. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, wanting to comfort her, wanting to say that I thought she had played beautifully, wanting to bridge the gap that our mother had deliberately carved between us. Clarissa's head snapped up and her tear-streaked face contorted into something ugly and desperate. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice raw and cracked. "I hate you! Get out! Get out! Get out!" I had fled wounded and confused and had never mentioned that moment to anyone. For years I interpreted it as confirmation of what I already believed, that Clarissa hated me, that she saw me as the inferior sister our parents had always insisted I was, that she wanted nothing to do with me beyond the performances of family unity we were occasionally required to stage for outsiders. But sitting in this hospital bed 26 years later with the recording of my parents' betrayal still echoing in my ears, I suddenly understood that moment differently. Clarissa hadn't screamed at me because she hated me. She had screamed because I had witnessed her pain, had seen behind the mask of perfection she was required to wear, had caught a glimpse of the terrified, inadequate girl hiding inside the family's golden child. My presence in that doorway wasn't a comfort, it was a threat. Another witness to her failure, another pair of eyes that might report back to our mother that Clarissa was cracking under the pressure. Ethan seemed to sense where my thoughts had gone. He pulled out his phone again, but this time his expression was softer, almost sad. "I want to show you something else," he said. "Something that might change how you see your sister." He navigated to an Instagram profile I didn't recognize. Clarissa's public account apparently filled with the glossy, curated content of a lifestyle influencer. I scrolled through images of my sister at 33 flawless makeup designer clothes, a beautiful home decorated with obvious expense if not taste. Every photo showed her smiling, radiating the effortless perfection our mother had always demanded. To the outside world, Clarissa Stone had won the game of life. "Keep watching," Ethan said, and he opened a video that appeared to have been recorded, accidentally captured in the moments after Clarissa thought she had stopped filming. On screen, my sister's radiant smile collapsed the instant she lowered her phone. Her shoulders sagged, her face crumpled, and she reached for a prescription bottle on the table beside her. She shook out 2 pills, no 3, and swallowed them dry, her hands trembling slightly. Then she simply sat there, staring at nothing, her eyes hollow and empty in a way that reminded me of veterans I had worked with who had seen too much and felt too little. The video cut off after 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds told a story more honest than anything on her curated feed. "Your sister isn't your enemy," Ethan said quietly. "She's a prisoner. Your parents built her cage out of impossible expectations, and she's been trapped there for 33 years. The difference between you and Clarissa isn't that they loved her more, it's that they controlled her more. You escaped. You built a life on your own terms 500 miles away from their influence. She never got out. She's still performing, still trying to earn approval that will never come, still medicating herself just to survive another day in the spotlight they forced her into." The realization settled over me like a cold wave. I had spent my entire life envying Clarissa, resenting her, believing that she had received all the love our parents were capable of giving, while I received none. But love wasn't what they gave her. They gave her a role to play, a standard to meet, a treadmill of achievement that never stopped accelerating no matter how fast she ran. I was ignored because I couldn't be controlled. She was suffocated because she could. We had both been victims. We had just bled in different ways. "I never knew," I whispered. "I thought she had everything I wanted. I thought she was happy." "She's been trained since birth to make everyone think that," Ethan replied. "That's the whole point. Your parents don't want children, they want trophies. They want proof of their success, validation for their choices, extensions of their own egos that they can display for the neighbors. Clarissa became that trophy. You refused to be molded into one, so they discarded you instead." I thought about all the years of resentment I had harbored toward my sister, all the bitterness I had nursed over birthday presents and Christmas attention and parental pride that was never directed my way. I had blamed Clarissa for being the favorite, when really she was just a different kind of sacrifice on the altar of our parents' narcissism. Ethan's next words cut through my spiraling thoughts with surgical precision. "Clarissa has an 8-year-old daughter named Lily," he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "She got divorced 2 years ago, and your parents have been heavily involved in Lily's life since then. From what I've been able to observe, from what I've pieced together through various sources," he paused, his jaw tightening, "they're starting to treat that little girl the same way they treated you. The comparisons, the criticism, the impossible standards. The cycle is starting all over again, Camille. And this time, the target is a child who has no one to protect her." The name hit me like a physical blow. Lily. I had a niece named Lily, and I had never met her, never held her, never even seen a photograph of her face. 8 years of this child's existence had passed without me knowing anything about her beyond the bare fact that Clarissa had become a mother. My parents had never mentioned her in our sparse communications, and Clarissa and I hadn't spoken directly in years. An entire human being had grown from infant to second grader in the void of my estrangement from the Stone family. Ethan navigated to a different folder on his phone, one filled with images that made my heart clench with immediate visceral recognition. The first photo showed a little girl at what appeared to be a family gathering, Christmas, judging by the decorated tree in the background. She had Clarissa's delicate bone structure and light brown hair, but her eyes were what stopped me cold. They were large and watchful, and unbearably sad, the eyes of a child who had learned too early that the world was not a safe place. She stood slightly apart from the rest of the group, her small body angled toward the edge of the frame, as if she were preparing to disappear at any moment. I knew those eyes. I had seen them every day in the mirror throughout my childhood. "This was taken last Christmas," Ethan said quietly. "I've been keeping track of the family through various means, public social media, mutual acquaintances, some methods I'd rather not detail. Every photo I find of Lily tells the same story." He swiped to another image. A birthday party, pink balloons and an elaborate cake, Clarissa and my parents beaming at the camera while Lily sat at the head of the table with the frozen smile of a child who had been instructed to look happy. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension that no 8-year-old should carry. Another swipe. A family video shot at what looked like Thanksgiving dinner, probably the very gathering I had been driving toward when the accident happened. The camera panned across the table, capturing my parents' elegant dining room, the gleaming china, the perfectly arranged centerpiece. And there, in the corner of the frame, barely visible, stood Lily. Alone. Watching the adults laugh and toast and celebrate without her, her small face a mask of careful neutrality that I recognized with sickening clarity because I had worn that same mask for the first 18 years of my life. "She's me," I whispered. "She's exactly like I was." "The pattern is repeating," Ethan confirmed. "After Clarissa's divorce, your parents inserted themselves into Lily's life under the guise of helping their daughter through a difficult time. But their version of help looks remarkably like control. They've enrolled Lily in piano lessons, ballet classes, academic tutoring, all the same activities they pushed on Clarissa. They criticize her weight, her posture, her grades. I've heard from a source close to the family that your mother recently told Lily she was getting chubby and needed to watch what she eats." The words made me physically nauseous. I remembered being 9 years old, reaching for a second helping of mashed potatoes, and my mother's hand shooting out to stop me. "That's enough," she had said, her voice carrying clearly across the table. "You don't want to end up fat, do you? Boys don't like fat girls." I had put down my fork and hadn't eaten a full meal in front of my parents for years afterward. Now they were doing the same thing to Lily, planting the same seeds of self-hatred and inadequacy that had taken me decades of therapy to begin uprooting. 8 years old, and already being taught that her body was wrong, her appetite was shameful, her worth was measured by how little space she occupied. "There's more," Ethan continued, and his voice had taken on a harder edge. "Lily's teachers have noticed changes in her behavior over the past year. She's become withdrawn, reluctant to participate in class, anxious about making mistakes. Her second-grade teacher contacted Clarissa about it, suggesting that Lily might benefit from counseling. Your mother intercepted the message and told the teacher that Lily was just shy, and that the family handles their own problems. I thought about the children I worked with in my practice, the ones who came to me with eyes just like Lily's, carrying wounds inflicted by the people who were supposed to protect them. I knew the statistics, the long-term outcomes, the ways that childhood emotional abuse warped developing minds and left scars that never fully healed. I had dedicated my career to helping victims escape toxic family systems, and all the while my own niece had been trapped in the same pattern I had barely survived. Something fundamental shifted inside me as I stared at those photographs. For days now, had it only been days, I had been processing my own trauma, confronting the reality of parents who would let me die, rather than interrupt their party. I had been focused on my pain, my betrayal, my decades of unanswered questions. It had felt enormous, all-consuming, the center of a universe that contained only my suffering. But looking at Lily's sad eyes, I realized this was bigger than me. This wasn't just about justice for what had been done to Camille Stone. This was about breaking a cycle that had been churning through generations of my family, chewing up children and spitting out damaged adults who went on to damage their own children in turn. If I walked away now, if I retreated to Chicago and tried to forget what I had learned, Lily would grow up in the same emotional wasteland that had nearly destroyed me. She would learn the same lessons about her own worthlessness, develop the same coping mechanisms, carry the same invisible wounds into adulthood. Or maybe she wouldn't survive it at all. Not everyone did. "I can't let this happen," I said, and my voice sounded different to my own ears, stronger, more certain than I had felt in years. "I won't let them do to her what they did to me." Ethan nodded slowly, something like approval flickering in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" I thought about Clarissa trapped in her golden cage, medicating herself to survive another day of performing perfection. I thought about the screaming child who had driven me from her room 26 years ago, and I finally understood that scream for what it was. Not hatred, but terror. Terror of being seen, of being known, of having her carefully constructed facade recognized for the prison it actually was. Clarissa wasn't my enemy. She never had been. We had been pitted against each other by parents who understood that divided children were easier to control, that sisters who hated each other would never band together to challenge the family hierarchy. We had both been victims bleeding in different ways, and neither of us had ever recognized the other's wounds because we were too busy nursing our own. But Lily didn't have to become another casualty. Lily could still be saved if Clarissa and I could find a way to reach each other across the battlefield our parents had created. "I need to talk to Clarissa," I said, meeting Ethan's eyes with a determination I hadn't felt since the day I packed my car and drove away from my childhood home forever. Not as enemies. As sisters who survived the same war. Ethan reached for his laptop bag, which I hadn't noticed sitting beside his chair until now. He pulled out a slim computer and began typing, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent considerable time gathering intelligence. The screen glowed to life, and he angled it so I could see clearly from my hospital bed, adjusting the pillows behind me so I could sit up slightly without straining my surgical wounds. "Before you contact Clarissa, you need to see everything," he said. "You need to understand exactly what you're dealing with and how deep this goes. I've spent the last 2 days compiling evidence while you were unconscious, pulling together everything I could find about what happened on Thanksgiving Eve." He opened a video file, and suddenly I was looking at my parents' formal living room, decorated with the tasteful autumn arrangements my mother favored: burgundy dahlias, golden leaves, cream-colored candles, and crystal holders. The footage had clearly been taken from Clarissa's phone, probably intended for her Instagram stories, and it captured the Stone family's Thanksgiving Eve celebration in all its elegant glory. My mother appeared first resplendent in a burgundy dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent in Chicago. She was laughing at something off camera, her head tilted back in that practiced way she had perfected for social occasions, the picture of a gracious hostess entertaining her important guests. My father stood beside her in a charcoal suit, his arm around her waist, in a display of marital affection I had rarely witnessed in actual private moments. They looked happy. They looked successful. They looked like the perfect couple hosting the perfect party in their perfect home. This was filmed while I was bleeding out on a highway, while doctors were desperately trying to save my life, while a nurse was calling their phones and being told that their daughter's death would be an acceptable inconvenience. "Watch the background," Ethan said quietly. I focused on the edges of the frame, and my stomach turned to ice. There, on the antique sideboard behind my mother, her phone screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID was clearly visible: hospital. My mother glanced back at it, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second, and then she deliberately turned away. A moment later, the phone lit up again, and again, and again. 4 missed calls from the hospital, each one representing another attempt to save my life, each one dismissed without a second thought. In the video, my mother picked up her champagne glass and raised it toward the camera. "To another wonderful year with wonderful friends," she said, her voice warm and gracious. "We're so blessed to have all of you in our lives." Blessed. She used the word blessed, while her phone buzzed with notifications that her firstborn daughter might be dead within the hour. Ethan fast-forwarded to another section of the video, this one shakier, clearly taken, when Clarissa thought she was no longer recording. The camera angle was awkward, pointing toward a corner of the room where my father stood in hushed conversation with a man I didn't recognize. The man was wearing a police uniform, his badge catching the light from the chandelier overhead. "That's Officer Daniels," Ethan said. "He's a lieutenant with the county sheriff's department. He's also been a frequent guest at your parents' parties for the last decade." I watched as my father leaned close to the officer, speaking words I couldn't hear through the ambient noise of the party. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something, an envelope thick and white, the kind that might contain documents or cash or both. Officer Daniels took the envelope, glanced inside briefly, and nodded with the satisfied expression of a man concluding a successful business transaction. Then he tucked it into his own jacket and walked away, blending back into the party as if nothing had happened. "What was that?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "Insurance," Ethan replied, his voice hard. "Officer Daniels is the one who closed your accident investigation. Within 24 hours of your crash, the case was marked as resolved single-vehicle accident, no other parties involved, no charges filed, no follow-up required. The SUV that ran you off the road. No mention of it in the official report. The witness who called 911 and reported seeing another vehicle, never interviewed. Every piece of evidence that might have led to answers about what really happened that night was swept under the rug before you even woke up from surgery." I thought about the black SUV, the figure standing in the rain, the deliberate way they had watched me trapped in the wreckage before simply driving away. Someone had tried to kill me, or at the very least had caused my accident through reckless indifference to my safety. And my father had paid to make sure no one ever investigated who that someone might be. The video continued, capturing the moment the party reached its social apex. My mother called everyone together for a group photograph, arranging the guests with the precision of a Broadway director blocking a scene. The Stone family stood at the center, my parents flanking Clarissa, who held Lily in front of her like a prop. Everyone smiled. Everyone looked beautiful and successful and happy. Not a single person mentioned my name. Not a single face showed concern or worry or even passing curiosity about why I hadn't arrived as expected. I had been on my way to this gathering when my car was run off the road, and not one member of my family had apparently noticed or cared that I never showed up. "They knew," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "They knew I was hurt. They knew I might be dying, and they took a family portrait without me." "They didn't just know," Ethan corrected. "They planned. That video was posted to Clarissa's Instagram with the caption, 'Grateful for family and friends this Thanksgiving.' It was a deliberate statement, proof that the family was together, happy, untroubled by any unpleasant news that might have interrupted their celebration. If anyone later asked why they didn't rush to the hospital, they could point to that post and say they didn't know the severity of the situation." He closed the video and opened another file. This one, an audio recording. The timestamp showed it had been made 3 hours after the party ended. Roughly the same time I was being wheeled out of emergency surgery, still unconscious, still fighting for my life. "This is a phone call between Clarissa and your mother," Ethan said, his finger hovering over the play button. "I obtained it through means I won't detail, but it's authentic. And it explains why your father knew exactly what to say to delay your treatment." He paused, meeting my eyes with an expression of grim determination. "It also reveals what they were planning to do if you survived." Ethan pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the hospital room with the clipped, efficient tone she used when managing household staff or planning social events. Except this time she wasn't discussing catering arrangements or guest lists. She was discussing me. "The hospital situation is handled for now." Patricia said, her words slightly muffled, as if she were holding the phone away from her mouth while doing something else, removing jewelry perhaps, or pouring herself a nightcap after the party. "Your father spoke with them and planted enough doubt to slow things down. If she dies on the table, that solves one problem. But we need to prepare for the possibility that she survives." Clarissa's voice came through shakier, higher-pitched, with what sounded like barely contained anxiety. "Mom, what are you talking about? What do you mean solves one problem? She's my sister." "She's a complication." My mother's tone carried no trace of maternal feeling, no acknowledgement that she was discussing the potential death of her own child. She's been a complication since the day she was born, and now that Eleanor's estate has finally cleared probate, she's standing between this family and what should rightfully be ours. My breath caught in my throat. Grandma Eleanor's estate. I had inherited everything when she died 5 years ago, the house, her investments, her savings. It wasn't an enormous fortune, but it was substantial enough that I had been able to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on my apartment in Chicago. I had always assumed my parents' resentment of that inheritance was simply another manifestation of their general disdain for me, more evidence that I could never do anything right in their eyes. I had never imagined it might be motive for murder. If Camille survives, my mother continued, her voice taking on the business-like quality of someone reviewing a strategic plan. We proceed with Plan B. She was supposed to attend dinner tonight. We had witnesses ready, the Hendersons, the Martins, people whose testimony would hold up in court. She was going to have an episode become erratic, maybe even violent. Dr. Harrison owes your father a favor from that malpractice situation we helped him bury. He's agreed to provide a psychiatric evaluation that would support a finding of mental incompetence. The clinical precision of her words made my skin crawl. They had planned this. Before I ever got in my car to drive home before the accident, before any of it, they had been preparing to have me declared mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. The Thanksgiving dinner I had dreaded wasn't just an obligation or a performance. It was a trap. Once she's declared incompetent, my mother went on, we petition the court for conservatorship, as her closest living relatives will be granted control of Eleanor's estate. The house alone is worth nearly $1 million in today's market. Combined with the investments and the, Mom, I don't think. Clarissa's voice cracked, and I heard something in it that surprised me, reluctance. Not enthusiasm for the plan, not eager participation in the conspiracy, but the trembling protest of someone being pushed toward something they didn't want to do. My mother cut her off with the verbal equivalent of a slap. Do you want Lily to have a future or not? Do you want her to go to good schools? Have opportunities, be somebody that takes money? Clarissa, money that Eleanor should have left to this family instead of throwing it away on that ungrateful... She stopped herself, took an audible breath. We're doing this for Lily, for the family's future. Camille was never really part of this family anyway. The recording continued for another few minutes, my mother outlining logistics and contingencies while Clarissa made occasional sounds of reluctant acknowledgement. But I had stopped fully listening because my mind was snagging on something my mother had said earlier, a phrase that didn't quite fit with everything else. Wait, I said, and Ethan paused the recording. Go back. There was something. He rewound, and I listened again until I found it. My mother's voice slightly softer, but no less venomous. If she ever finds out the truth about her father, we lose everything. Everything we've built, everything we've maintained, all of it gone. Not your father, not our family. Her father. The phrasing was specific, deliberate, carrying a weight of meaning that extended far beyond the context of the conversation. I looked at Ethan, and something in his expression told me he had been waiting for me to catch this, had known all along that this moment would come. He didn't look surprised or confused. He looked like a man bracing himself to deliver news that would change everything. What truth about my father? I asked slowly. She said her father, not your father, when talking to Clarissa. Why would she phrase it that way unless... I couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too enormous, too destabilizing to the already crumbling foundation of everything I thought I knew about my life. Ethan reached over and paused the recording completely, then set his laptop aside. He turned to face me fully, his expression grave and gentle at the same time, the look of someone who had carried a heavy secret for a very long time and was finally about to set it down. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, he said. I've known for years, but it wasn't my place to say anything. Your grandmother wanted to tell you herself, but she ran out of time, and after she was gone, he shook his head. There was never a right moment. You had built a life for yourself, you seemed stable, and I thought maybe some truths were better left buried. Just tell me. My voice came out stronger than I felt a command rather than a plea. Whatever it is, just tell me. I'm done being protected from the truth. Ethan held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Sorrow, maybe, or the weight of knowledge he had carried alone for far too long. Camille, he said finally. The man you've called Dad for 36 years. The man who told the hospital to let you die. The man who paid a police officer to bury your accident investigation. He paused, and I watched him steel himself for words that would shatter my world completely. Richard Stone isn't your biological father. You're not his daughter. You never were. The words hung in the air between us, impossible and undeniable at the same time. Richard Stone isn't your biological father. I heard them clearly, understood their meaning on an intellectual level, but my mind refused to fully process what Ethan had just told me. It was like being told that gravity had been optional all along, or that the sky I had looked at my entire life had actually been green rather than blue. The foundation of my identity, already fractured by the events of the past few days, now crumbled completely. That's not possible, I heard myself say, even as some deep part of me recognized that it was not only possible but made a terrible kind of sense. My mother would never. She's too concerned about appearances, about reputation. She would never have. She was young, Ethan said gently. 22 years old, still living under her mother's roof, still subject to her mother's control. And she was in love. He reached for his laptop and pulled up a photograph I had never seen before. A young man in a military uniform, handsome in a quiet way, with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera and into my soul. There was something familiar about his face, something that tugged at the edges of recognition, though I was certain I had never met him. His name is James Porter, Ethan continued. He was a medical student when your mother met him working part-time at the hospital where Eleanor volunteered. They fell in love genuinely deeply, the kind of love that young people believe will conquer anything. But James came from nothing. His father was a factory worker, his mother a waitress. He had no money, no family connections, no social standing whatsoever. I stared at the photograph at this stranger, who was apparently my father, and tried to reconcile his existence with everything I thought I knew about my own history. Eleanor disapproved from the beginning, Ethan said. She had plans for Patricia's marriage to someone suitable, someone who could elevate the family's position in society. Richard Stone was already wealthy, already connected, already everything Eleanor wanted for her daughter. When she discovered that Patricia was pregnant with James's child, she faced a choice between her social ambitions and her daughter's happiness. She chose ambition. The words came out flat, unsurprised. I had never known my grandmother to be anything other than loving toward me, but I was beginning to understand that love and moral perfection were not the same thing. She forced Patricia to end the relationship with James, told him that Patricia had decided she didn't love him after all, that she had chosen a different path. James was devastated, but he was also proud he refused to beg or fight for someone who had apparently rejected him. He joined the army as a doctor, shipped out overseas, and tried to forget about the woman he had lost. And my mother married Richard Stone. Ethan nodded. The wedding was rushed. Society gossip attributed it to eagerness and young love, but the truth was that Eleanor needed to get Patricia married before her pregnancy became obvious. You were born 7 months later, officially premature, but actually right on time. Richard Stone knew from the beginning that you weren't his biological child. It was part of the arrangement. Arrangement. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. What kind of arrangement involves raising a child you know isn't yours? The kind that benefits everyone except the child. Ethan's voice hardened with barely suppressed anger. Richard got a beautiful young wife from a respectable family. Patricia got the security and status her mother demanded. Eleanor got to maintain her social position and see her daughter married well. And you, He paused, his jaw tightening. You were the price they all agreed to pay. Richard accepted you as part of the package, but on one condition: you would never be treated as his equal, never receive the same inheritance as any biological children. He and Patricia might have never be acknowledged as a true stone. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. The cold distance Richard had maintained throughout my childhood wasn't the behavior of a disappointed father. It was the deliberate cruelty of a man forced to tolerate the presence of another man's child in his home. He hadn't attended my school events because he didn't consider me his daughter. He hadn't looked me in the eyes because every time he did, he saw evidence of his wife's past proof that she had loved someone else first and better. His refusal to save my life wasn't just callousness, it was the final rejection of a child he had never wanted and had only pretended to accept. I wasn't a failed daughter. I was an unwanted reminder, a living ghost of a relationship my mother had been forced to abandon, a constant presence that prevented Richard Stone from ever fully possessing the woman he had bought with his money and status. The grief came first, washing over me in waves that made my chest ache with physical pain. I mourned the father I had never had, the relationship I had spent 36 years trying to build with a man who was constitutionally incapable of loving me. All those years of trying harder, doing better, making myself smaller and quieter and more agreeable, none of it had ever mattered. I could have been perfect in every way, and Richard Stone would still have looked through me as if I didn't exist, because to him I wasn't supposed to exist at all. Then came the relief, strange and unexpected, and almost shameful in its intensity. It wasn't my fault. It had never been my fault. The inadequacy I had carried like a stone in my chest since childhood, the constant belief that I was fundamentally unworthy of love. These were lies I had been told by people who had their own reasons for wanting me to feel small. Richard Stone's rejection said nothing about my value as a person. It said everything about his own limitations, his wounded pride, his inability to love a child who wasn't biologically his. And finally, rising beneath the grief and relief like lava beneath the earth's surface, came the anger. Not at Richard Stone, whose cruelty at least had an explanation now, but at the entire system that had conspired to punish a child for choices she had never made. Eleanor, who had valued social position over her daughter's happiness and her granddaughter's well-being. Patricia, who had accepted the arrangement and taken out her resentment on the child she was forced to keep. An entire network of adults making decisions that would damage a little girl for decades, all to maintain appearances and protect interests that had nothing to do with love or family or basic human decency. My biological father. I whispered, my eyes returning to the photograph on Ethan's laptop, to those kind eyes that looked so much like my own. James Porter. Is he still alive? Ethan's expression shifted at my question, moving through a complex series of emotions that I couldn't fully read. Hope and sorrow, and something that looked almost like relief, as if he had been waiting a very long time to have this conversation. He looked down at the photograph of James Porter still displayed on his laptop screen, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. James Porter is alive, he said. He's 67 years old now, retired from the military, living in a small town about 4 hours from here. He paused, and I watched him gather himself for whatever came next. And he's my father, my adoptive father. He raised me. The words took a moment to penetrate, to rearrange themselves into meaning inside my exhausted mind. Ethan's adoptive father was my biological father, the man who had watched over me for 19 years, who had saved my life when my own parents wouldn't, who had appeared at my bedside like a guardian angel summoned from the past. He wasn't just my grandmother's chosen protector. He was family in a way I had never imagined. I don't understand, I said slowly. How is that possible? How did you end up? Ethan turned his chair to face me more fully, settling in for a story that clearly had deep roots. After your mother ended things with him, James was destroyed. He had been planning to propose to build a life with her, and suddenly she was gone, married to another man within weeks, pregnant with a child James didn't know was his. He threw himself into his military service, became one of the most dedicated combat surgeons in his unit. He saved hundreds of lives over the next decade, earning commendations and medals that he kept in a box he never opened because they reminded him of everything he had lost. I tried to imagine this man I had never met carrying grief for a relationship he didn't fully understand, not knowing that somewhere in the world there was a child with his eyes and his blood wondering why her father didn't love her. When I was 6 years old, Ethan continued, James was deployed to a refugee camp in Eastern Europe. There had been ethnic cleansing in the region, entire villages destroyed, families torn apart. I was one of the orphans. Both my biological parents had been killed in the violence, and I had been living in the camp for almost a year, not speaking to anyone, not trusting anyone. The aid workers had essentially given up on me. His voice softened with memory, and I saw the shadow of that traumatized child pass across his features before disappearing behind the composed exterior of the man he had become. James was different. He didn't push. He didn't demand that I talk or perform recovery on his timeline. He just showed up day after day, sitting with me, reading to me in a language I didn't understand, bringing me small gifts of food or toys. It took months before I said my first word to him. It took a year before I let him hold my hand. Ethan smiled faintly. He waited. He was patient. He had lost one child, even though he didn't know it at the time, and I think some part of him was determined not to lose another. He adopted you. The paperwork took 3 years and cost him most of his savings. But yes, he adopted me. He brought me to America, gave me his name, raised me as his son. He taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about choice, about commitment, about showing up for the people you love even when it's hard. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. He never stopped mourning the daughter he thought he had lost. He told me about her when I was old enough to understand about your mother, about the pregnancy he didn't know about the letter he received saying the baby had died at birth. Died at birth. I repeated the words, hitting me like a physical blow. Someone told him I died. Ethan nodded grimly. Your grandmother. Eleanor sent him a letter 6 months after you were born, claiming there had been complications, that the baby hadn't survived. It was the final nail in the coffin of any hope he might have had about reconnecting with your mother. He grieved for years for the woman he had loved, for the child he would never know. That grief shaped everything about who he became. I thought about Grandma Eleanor, about the woman who had slipped me extra pie and called me her treasure, and I felt something complicated twist in my chest. She had loved me. I was certain of that. But she had also lied to my biological father, stolen 36 years of relationship from both of us, participated in a conspiracy of silence that had caused immeasurable pain to everyone involved. Does James know I'm alive? I asked, afraid of the answer either way. Does he know now? He found out 5 years ago. Ethan met my eyes steadily. Your grandmother told him the truth shortly before she died. She tracked him down, confessed everything, the lie about your death, the forced marriage, all of it. She said she couldn't go to her grave without trying to make it right. But if he's known for 5 years, why didn't he? I stopped, realizing, even as I spoke, that I already knew the answer. The Stone family, their money, their connections, their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their carefully constructed world. He tried, Ethan said, and his voice hardened with old anger. The moment Eleanor told him the truth, James wanted to find you to introduce himself, to finally know his daughter. But the Stone family found out somehow, probably through Eleanor's correspondence being monitored. They threatened him with everything they had. Restraining orders claiming he was a stalker, defamation lawsuits, public accusations that would have destroyed his reputation and his pension. He shook his head bitterly. James isn't a wealthy man. He's a retired military doctor living on a fixed income. He couldn't afford the legal battle it would have taken to fight through their wall of lawyers. So he just gave up. No. Ethan leaned forward, his intensity burning through his careful composure. He asked me to watch over you instead, to keep you safe from a distance, to make sure you were okay, to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. He's been waiting, Camille. For 5 years, he's been waiting for the chance to finally meet his daughter. Something broke open inside me, not painfully, but like a flower unfurling toward unexpected sunlight. Somewhere in the world, there was a man who wanted me. A father who had grieved for me, who had spent decades believing I was dead, who had learned the truth and immediately tried to find me despite every obstacle in his path. "Where is he now?" I whispered. "Is he still waiting?" Ethan's eyes filled with something that looked like hope, like the promise of healing after a long illness. "There's something I need to show you first," he said. "Before you can meet him, before any of this can move forward, you need to understand everything your grandmother did to protect you, and everything she didn't do that she should have." 3 days after waking up in the hospital, the doctors finally cleared me for discharge with strict instructions about rest and follow-up appointments that I only half heard. My mind was consumed by everything Ethan had revealed, the layers of secrets and lies that had shaped my entire existence without my knowledge. I signed the paperwork mechanically, accepted the wheelchair ride to the exit, and climbed carefully into Ethan's truck with movements that sent dull aches radiating from my healing abdomen. "Where are we going?" I asked as he pulled out of the hospital parking lot. "Your grandmother's house." He glanced at me, gauging my reaction. "The property you inherited. There's something there you need to see, something Eleanor left specifically for you to find." I hadn't been back to that house since the funeral 5 years ago. The memories it contained were too complicated, love and warmth tangled with the knowledge that my grandmother had kept secrets from me, had participated in deceptions that had caused immeasurable harm. I had hired a property management company to maintain it, had paid the taxes and utilities from a distance. But I had never been able to bring myself to walk through those rooms again. The drive took 2 hours, winding through countryside that grew increasingly familiar as we approached the town where I had grown up. Ethan navigated the streets from memory, passing landmarks of my childhood, the school where I had been invisible, the park where I had read alone on summer afternoons, the church where my family had performed their weekly ritual of respectable attendance. Finally, we turned onto the tree-lined street where Eleanor's Victorian house stood like a faded grande dame, its white paint peeling slightly, its garden overgrown but still beautiful. Ethan helped me out of the truck and up the porch steps, producing a key that I didn't ask how he had obtained. The door swung open onto a foyer thick with dust and memories, afternoon light filtering through lace curtains onto furniture draped in protective sheets. The smell hit me immediately. Old wood and dried flowers, and something indefinably Eleanor, a presence that lingered even 5 years after her death. "This way," Ethan said, guiding me through the kitchen to a door I remembered as leading to the basement. The stairs were steep and narrow, and I gripped the railing tightly as we descended into the cool darkness below. Ethan found a light switch, and bare bulbs flickered to life, illuminating a space filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life boxes of Christmas decorations, furniture too worn for upstairs, but too precious to discard the detritus of decades. He led me to the far corner, where a wooden panel that looked like part of the foundation wall stood slightly askew. With practiced movements that suggested he had done this before, Ethan pressed on a specific spot, and the panel swung inward, revealing a small alcove that had been invisible from the main basement. Inside the alcove sat a single object, a wooden box about the size of a bread box, its surface carved with military insignia I didn't recognize. Ethan lifted it carefully and set it on a nearby workbench, then stepped back to give me space. "Eleanor showed me this hiding place before she died," he said quietly. "She made me promise not to open it until you were ready, until it was time for you to know everything." My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, preserved with obvious care, lay a collection of items that told a story I had never known. Love letters, dozens of them, written in 2 different hands. My mother's precise script and a looser, more passionate hand that must have belonged to James Porter. Photographs of a young couple clearly in love, their faces radiant with the particular joy of people who believe their happiness will last forever. A pressed flower, its color faded to brown. A silver ring, simple and unadorned, that might have been an engagement ring from a man who couldn't afford diamonds. And beneath all of it, a sealed envelope, with my name written across the front in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. I opened it with shaking fingers and unfolded the pages inside. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Eleanor's death, her normally elegant script wavering slightly with illness and age. "My darling Camille," it began, and I could hear her voice in my head, could feel her presence wrapping around me like one of the hugs she used to give when no one else was watching. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Ethan has judged that the time has finally come for you to know the truth. I pray that you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman who loved you more than anything, but lacked the courage to show it in the ways that mattered most." I read on, my vision blurring with tears, as Eleanor's confession unfolded across the pages. "I am the reason your life has been filled with pain. 50 years ago, I was a different woman, proud, ambitious, terrified of scandal and social judgment. When your mother fell in love with James Porter, I saw only his poverty, his lack of connections, his unsuitability as a match for my daughter. I forced her to end the relationship. I arranged her marriage to Richard Stone, and when I discovered she was pregnant with James's child, I made the decision that haunts me to this day." The letter continued, each paragraph another stone added to the cairn of truth that Eleanor had spent her final years building. "I told James that his baby died at birth. I wrote him a letter filled with false sympathy describing a tragedy that never happened, ensuring he would never come looking for the child. I had decided he didn't deserve to know. I watched you grow up in a house where you were treated as an unwanted burden, and I told myself it was for the best, that the alternative would have been worse. I was wrong. I was so terribly, unforgivably wrong." The pages trembled in my hands as I read about Eleanor's journey toward redemption. Her decision as death approached to finally tell James the truth. Her arrangement with Ethan to watch over me. Her careful legal work ensuring that I, not my parents, would inherit everything she had. "I have left you everything I own," the letter concluded. "Not just money and property, but the truth itself. You deserve to know your father. You deserve to be loved by someone who wanted you unconditionally. I was too proud and too scared to give you that while I lived. I can only hope this letter gives you the freedom I never could." And then, in slightly shaky handwriting, the final line, "James is still alive. He's been waiting for you, and Ethan knows where to find him." I sat with my grandmother's letter for a long time, reading and rereading her words until they blurred together through my tears. Ethan waited patiently, giving me the space to process a lifetime of secrets compressed into a few handwritten pages. When I finally looked up, my face wet, but my mind clearer than it had been in days, he simply nodded and handed me a tissue from his pocket. "There's more," he said gently. "Eleanor kept extensive records, journals, documents, financial statements. She wanted you to have everything you needed to understand what happened and to protect yourself going forward. But we need to search the rest of the house to find it all." When we climbed back up from the basement, the wooden box tucked securely under my arm, and began a systematic exploration of the house I had inherited but never truly possessed. What I found made my heart ache with fresh grief and rekindled anger. The Stone family had been here, not to care for the property or preserve Eleanor's memory, but to pillage it. The elegant parlor where my grandmother had served tea was now cluttered with boxes of junk from my parents' house, broken furniture, outdated electronics, bags of clothing destined for donation but never delivered. They had turned Eleanor's beloved home into a storage dump, a repository for items too worthless to keep but too bothersome to properly dispose of. The message was clear now that Eleanor was dead. Her space, like her granddaughter, was merely something to be used and discarded. I found photo albums shoved into a closet, their pages water-damaged from a leak that no one had bothered to fix. Family pictures spanning decades, memories preserved in fading color, all left to rot because they held no value to people who measured worth only in dollars and social capital. I gathered them carefully, adding them to the growing pile of items I intended to take with me. In the study where Eleanor had managed her affairs, I discovered a filing cabinet that had been partially emptied but not completely searched. Whoever had gone through it had been looking for something specific, discarding documents that didn't match their criteria. I found her journals, leather-bound books filled with her elegant handwriting, chronicling years of private thoughts and observations. I found financial records that stopped my breath when I understood what they represented. "Ethan," I called softly, and he appeared in the doorway. "Look at this." The documents showed a pattern of payments stretching back 5 years, transfers from Eleanor's accounts to a law firm in another state. The notation on each one was simple: Porter Legal Fund. My grandmother had been secretly financing James's attempts to find me to fight through the legal barriers the Stone family had erected. Even as her health failed, even as death approached, she had been working to undo the damage she had caused. "She never gave up," Ethan said, examining the records. "Right until the end, she was trying to make it right." We moved upstairs to continue our search, and that's when the house began to feel different. The master bedroom where Eleanor had spent her final months should have been preserved in the same dusty stillness as the rest of the property. Instead, we found fresh disturbances in the accumulated grime. Footprints in the dust on the hardwood floor, multiple sets, none of them ours. The patterns suggested someone had been here recently, walking purposefully through the room, stopping at specific locations. The dresser drawers hung partially open, their contents rifled through and left in disarray. Papers were scattered across the bed, as if someone had been sorting through documents in a hurry, taking some and leaving others. "Someone's been searching," I whispered, a chill running down my spine despite the stuffy warmth of the closed-up house. They were looking for something. Ethan's expression hardened as he examined the room with military precision. "Looking for the same things we just found," he said grimly. "The letters, the photographs, the financial records. Anything that could prove what the Stone family did." I thought about the carefully hidden alcove in the basement, about the wooden box that had remained undiscovered, despite what was clearly an extensive search. Eleanor had known. She had anticipated that her home would be violated, that her secrets would be hunted by people who wanted them destroyed. She had hidden the most damaging evidence in a place only someone she trusted would know to look. "We need to take everything and go," Ethan said, already moving toward the door. "Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it, which means they might come back. We should—" He stopped mid-sentence, his entire body going rigid with alertness. I heard it too, a sound from downstairs that hadn't been there moments before. The creak of a floorboard under weight. The soft click of a door being closed with deliberate care. Someone had entered the house. Ethan put a finger to his lips and gestured for me to move behind the bed, out of sight from the doorway. His hand moved to his hip, and I realized for the first time that he was armed, a small pistol holstered beneath his jacket, the kind of precaution a man takes when he expects trouble. He positioned himself beside the bedroom door, listening intently to the sounds from below. Heavy footsteps moved through the first floor, making no effort at stealth now. Whoever it was knew the house was supposed to be empty and wasn't concerned about being heard. I heard them moving through the parlor, the kitchen approaching the stairs with the confident stride of someone who had been here before. Ethan caught my eye and nodded once, a signal that he was going to confront whoever was below. I wanted to protest, to beg him not to put himself in danger, but the words died in my throat as he slipped silently through the doorway and descended toward the intruder. I waited in the suffocating silence, every second stretching into an eternity. Then I heard Ethan's voice, cold and commanding. "Don't move." A pause. Then the click of a light switch and a voice I didn't recognize but immediately despised. "Well, well. I was wondering when you two would show up." I crept to the top of the stairs, peering down through the railing, and saw Ethan standing in the living room with his gun drawn, facing a man in a police uniform. The same uniform I had seen in the Thanksgiving video. The same man who had accepted an envelope from my father while I lay bleeding in a hospital bed. Officer Daniels smiled up at me. and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. I descended the stairs slowly, my surgical wounds protesting each step, but I refused to show weakness in front of this man who had taken my father's money while I lay dying. Officer Daniels watched my approach with an expression that mixed surprise with calculation, as if he were rapidly adjusting plans that had been built on the assumption of my death. "Ms. Stone," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I'm glad to see you recovered from your accident. We were all so worried." "I'm sure you were." I stopped beside Ethan, drawing strength from his steady presence and the gun he still held at his side. "What are you doing in my house?" Daniel's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes, the recalibration of a predator who had expected easy prey and found something more dangerous instead. "We received a report of a break-in," he said smoothly. "As a courtesy to your family, I came to check on the property personally. The front door was unlocked, and I was concerned there might be intruders." "The door was locked when we arrived," Ethan said, his voice flat with controlled anger. "I have the key. This is private property, legally owned by Camille Stone, and you have no warrant authorizing your presence here. Under the Fourth Amendment, your entry constitutes an illegal search." The mention of constitutional law seemed to catch Daniels off guard. His smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself into something colder, more threatening. "I don't need a warrant to respond to a welfare check. And you—" He turned to Ethan with naked hostility. "I don't know who you are, but you should be careful about inserting yourself into family business that doesn't concern you." "Everything about Camille's welfare concerns me." Ethan didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made Daniels take an involuntary step backward. "Including the accident investigation that you closed within 24 hours. No witness interviews, no follow-up on the other vehicle involved, no attempt to identify the driver who ran her off the road. That's not standard procedure, officer. That's obstruction." The accusation hung in the air between them, and I watched Daniel's facade crack further. The friendly neighborhood cop routine was gone now, replaced by something uglier, the face of a man who had sold his badge and was willing to do whatever it took to protect that transaction. "You should be careful digging into things that don't concern you," he said, and all pretense of civility had vanished from his voice. "The Stone family has been part of this community for generations. They have friends here, important friends, judges, business owners, people who matter." He smiled, but it was the smile of a shark scenting blood. "Your little crusade against them isn't going to end well. Trust me on that." "Is that a threat?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Daniels turned to face me directly, and I saw in his eyes the same contempt I had spent my entire childhood trying to escape the look of someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "It's advice. Free advice from someone who knows how things work around here." He moved toward the door, and for a moment I thought he was simply going to leave. But he stopped with his hand on the knob and turned back, his gaze locking onto mine with deliberate intensity. "Your parents sent me with a message," he said. "They want you to come home. Sign the papers they've prepared, transfer control of Eleanor's estate to the family trust, and all of this unpleasantness goes away. No lawsuits, no investigations, no complications. You can go back to your little life in Chicago and pretend none of this ever happened." "And if I refuse?" Daniel shrugged with theatrical indifference. "Then things get complicated. For everyone." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, then looked back one final time. "Think about it, Camille. Some fights aren't worth winning, and some families have longer memories than you might imagine." The door closed behind him, and I listened to his footsteps crossing the porch and descending to his patrol car. Only when the engine started and the sound of tires on gravel faded into the distance did I allow myself to breathe again. "He was looking for Eleanor's evidence," Ethan said grimly. "The Stone family must have suspected she kept records documentation of what they did. They've been searching this house probably for months, trying to find and destroy anything that could be used against them. But they didn't find the basement alcove." "No, Eleanor was smarter than they gave her credit for." He pulled out his phone and began dialing. I need to call someone. A lawyer I served with, he's handled military justice cases, whistleblower protections cases where powerful people were trying to silence witnesses. If anyone can help us navigate this, it's him. I listened as Ethan spoke in low, urgent tones, outlining the situation with military precision. The accident. The hospital calls the corrupt investigation the evidence we had gathered. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, and by the time he hung up, his expression had grown even more serious. "The situation is worse than we thought," he said. "The Stone family has deep connections here. Law enforcement, the judiciary, local media. Marcus says we need to be extremely careful about who we trust and how we proceed. One wrong move and they could have us arrested on fabricated charges or worse." "So what do? We fight smart." Ethan's jaw set with determination. "We have evidence they don't know about. We have Eleanor's documentation, the hospital recordings, the video from the party. We build our case carefully, make sure it's airtight, and then we take it somewhere their influence can't reach." His phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at the screen, and I watched his expression shift from determination to surprise to cautious hope. "What is it?" He held up the phone so I could see the message. "They know she's alive. She's not safe. Meet me at the old cemetery at midnight. I have information. See." "See?" I whispered, my heart suddenly pounding. "Clarissa." The cemetery gates stood open in the darkness, wrought iron silhouettes against a sky heavy with clouds that obscured the moon. Ethan had argued against coming, had pointed out all the ways this could be a trap. But something in the message had convinced me that Clarissa's desperation was genuine. My sister had never reached out to me for anything in our entire adult lives. The fact that she was doing so now through anonymous texts and secret midnight meetings spoke to a level of fear that I recognized intimately from my own childhood. We parked on a side road and approached on foot, Ethan moving with the silent precision of his military training, while I followed as quietly as my healing body would allow. The old section of the cemetery stretched before us, rows of weathered headstones marking generations of the town's departed. Eleanor's grave lay at the far end beneath the maple tree that had drawn her to this spot when she purchased her plot decades ago. A figure stood beside the grave, barely visible in the darkness. As we drew closer, I recognized the silhouette of my sister, but everything else about her was wrong. The Clarissa I knew from Instagram and family photos was always immaculate, perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The woman waiting for us looked like she had been hollowed out from the inside. She wore dark jeans and an oversized hoodie that swallowed her thin frame. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of any cosmetic enhancement. Without the armor of her careful presentation, Clarissa looked older than her 33 years, exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleepless nights. Her hands trembled visibly as she clutched her phone, and when she spoke, her voice came out in an urgent whisper that cracked with barely contained emotion. "I don't have much time. Mom has people watching me. She thinks I'm at a late dinner with sponsors. If I'm gone too long, she'll send someone to check." Clarissa's eyes darted between me and Ethan, assessing, calculating, but beneath the caution, I saw something I had never expected from her genuine terror. "Is he safe? Can he be trusted?" "He saved my life," I said simply. "He's the only reason I'm standing here." Clarissa nodded jerkily, accepting this without further question. "I need you to understand something before I say anything else. I know you hate me. I know you think I've spent my whole life being the golden child while you suffered. But you don't know what it's been like being the one they actually pay attention to. Their attention is poison, Camille. It eats you alive from the inside." I'm starting to understand that. Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or relief that she wouldn't have to explain the unexplainable. I knew about their plan, the dinner, the witnesses, the psychiatric evaluation. I heard them discussing it weeks ago, planning how to have you declared incompetent so they could take Eleanor's estate. Her voice broke. "I tried to warn you. I sent texts from a burner phone telling you not to come making up excuses trying to scare you into staying away. But you kept driving. The anonymous messages. I had received them during my drive, vague warnings that I had dismissed as spam or wrong numbers. My sister had been trying to protect me, and I had been too conditioned to distrust her to recognize it. When the texts didn't work, I panicked. Clarissa continued, tears streaming down her cheeks now. I called a friend, someone who owed me a favor, and asked him to follow you to find a way to make you turn around before you reached the house. I told him to block the road, fake a police checkpoint, anything that would convince you to go back to Chicago. She dissolved into sobs. I never wanted you hurt. I just wanted you to stay away from them. The accident, the rain, he lost control, trying to cut you off. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The black SUV, the figure watching me in the wreckage, it hadn't been an assassin sent by my parents. It had been a botched rescue attempt by my sister, a desperate gamble that had gone catastrophically wrong. He was supposed to help you, Clarissa whispered. When he saw the crash, he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He called me hysterical, saying you were trapped and bleeding and he was afraid to stay because there might be cameras. I told him to leave to get away before anyone connected him to me. I thought... She couldn't finish the sentence. You thought I was going to die anyway, I said flatly. I thought someone would save you. The words came out anguished, pleading. I called 911 from another burner phone as soon as he told me what happened. I reported the accident, gave them the location. I thought that would be enough. I didn't know about the hospital, about Mom and Dad refusing to authorize treatment. I didn't know until the next morning when they were celebrating that you hadn't showed up and might never show up again. I wanted to hate her. Part of me still did, for the lifetime of rivalry and resentment for the way she had always seemed to bask in the parental attention that I was denied. But standing here in the darkness beside our grandmother's grave, I saw my sister clearly for the first time. She wasn't my enemy. She was another prisoner of the Stone family machine, just as trapped as I had been, just bleeding in different ways. They're escalating, Clarissa said, pulling herself together with visible effort. They know you survived, and they know you're not going to sign away Eleanor's estate quietly. Dad's hired a PR firm, the same people who rehabilitate politicians after scandals. They're building a narrative that you're mentally unstable, that you've had a breakdown, that your accusations against the family are the ravings of a disturbed woman seeking attention and money. Let them try, I said with more confidence than I felt. You don't understand. They'll bury you. They'll plant stories with every outlet that owes them favors. They'll find people to testify that you were always troubled, always difficult. By the time they're done, no one will believe a word you say. Clarissa grabbed my hand with desperate intensity. Unless we destroy them first, together. I stared at her, at this stranger who was also my blood, and saw the terrible hope burning in her eyes. I have recordings, she said. Bank statements, emails, everything they've done for years. The bribes, the cover-ups, the threats against anyone who crossed them. I've been collecting evidence since Lily was born because I knew someday I might need to escape. Her grip tightened painfully. But if I give this to you, I lose everything. My reputation, my money, my place in their world. Maybe even Lily if they fight for custody. I need to know you'll protect my daughter. Promise me, Camille. Promise me that whatever happens, you'll help me keep Lily safe. I looked at Clarissa in the pale light filtering through the cemetery trees, and for the first time in my life, I truly saw her. Not the golden child who had stolen our parents' affection. Not the perfect sister whose shadow I could never escape. Not the rival I had resented for 36 years of competitions I never asked to enter. I saw a woman on the verge of complete collapse, held together by prescription medications, and desperate fear, her perfect facade crumbling to reveal the broken person underneath. Her hands hadn't stopped shaking since we arrived. Up close, I could see the toll that years of performing perfection had taken, the thinness that went beyond fashionable into something approaching skeletal, the dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide, the way she flinched at small sounds, as if expecting punishment to arrive from any direction. This was what being the favored child had cost her. This was the prize she had won in a game neither of us had chosen to play. "I'm so tired," Clarissa whispered, and the words seemed to drain the last of her energy. "I've spent my entire life trying to be what they wanted, trying to earn love that was never really love at all. It was just approval, conditional approval, that could be withdrawn at any moment if I failed to perform. Every smile, every achievement, every perfect photograph, none of it was ever enough. There was always something else to prove, some new standard to meet." I thought about my own childhood, about the invisibility I had worn like a second skin, and realized for the first time that Clarissa's visibility had been its own kind of prison. I had been ignored, but she had been watched, scrutinized, evaluated constantly against impossible benchmarks that shifted every time she came close to reaching them. We had both been damaged by the same parents. They had simply used different weapons on each of us. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you willing to turn against them now after all these years?" Clarissa's composure shattered completely, and the sob that escaped her was raw and ugly and absolutely genuine. "Because of Lily. Because I watched it start and I couldn't stop it, and I hate myself for not being strong enough to protect her." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "Last week we were getting ready for her dance recital. Lily was so excited, she's been practicing for months, working so hard. She came downstairs in her costume, twirling around the living room, and she looked so happy, so free. I waited, knowing whatever came next would be terrible. Mom looked at her and said, 'You've gotten chubby. That costume makes you look fat. What will people think?'" Clarissa's voice cracked. "Lily is 8 years old. 8. And my mother told her she was too fat to dance in front of people." The words hit me with the force of a memory I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten it existed. I was 9 years old, reaching for a second helping at dinner, my mother's hand shooting out to stop me. "That's enough. You don't want to end up fat, do you?" The shame of that moment had shaped my relationship with food for the next decade, had planted seeds of self-hatred that I was still struggling to uproot in therapy 27 years later. "Lily stopped eating dinner that night," Clarissa continued. "She said she wasn't hungry, but I saw her face. I saw the way she looked at herself in the mirror before bed, pinching her stomach, turning sideways to examine her profile. My daughter is 8 years old, and my mother has already taught her to hate her own body." I reached out and took both of Clarissa's hands in mine. They were ice cold, despite the mild night, trembling with emotion and exhaustion, and the aftermath of years of chemical management of her own mental health. In that moment, we weren't the rivals our parents had created. We weren't the good daughter and the bad daughter, the success and the failure. We were two survivors of the same war, two women who had been wounded by the same weapons, finally recognizing each other across the battlefield. "It's going to happen again," Clarissa said, her eyes pleading with me to understand. "Everything they did to us, they're going to do to Lily. The comparisons, the criticism, the impossible standards. I've already seen them starting to favor her cousin over her at family gatherings. Already seen them setting up the same dynamics that destroyed us. And I can't stop it alone. I've tried, Camille. I've tried to set boundaries, tried to limit their access to her. But they have so much leverage over me. The money, the social connections, the threat of cutting me off completely." "You don't need them," I said. "You never did. None of us did. I don't know how to survive without them." The admission came out small and ashamed. They made sure of that. They made sure I was dependent on them for everything, financially, emotionally, socially. Every part of my life is built on foundations they control. If I turn against them, I lose it all. I thought about the evidence she had gathered, the years of documentation, the courage it must have taken to compile ammunition against people who controlled every aspect of her existence. Clarissa had been planning her escape for years, quietly building a case while maintaining the facade of the perfect daughter. She had been waiting for someone strong enough to fight alongside her. "I'll testify," she said finally, her voice steadying with resolve. "I'll give you everything I have, the recordings, the financial records, all of it. We'll take them down together, destroy their reputation like they tried to destroy you." She gripped my hands harder. "But you have to promise me. Whatever happens, whatever it costs, you'll help me get Lily away from them. That's all I care about anymore. Saving my daughter." I looked into my sister's eyes and saw the same fear I had carried my whole life, the terror of being trapped, of being controlled, of watching the cycle repeat itself in someone you love. We had wasted so many years as enemies when we should have been allies. We couldn't get those years back, but we could make sure Lily never lost any of hers. "I promise," I said. "We're going to end this. Together." Clarissa collapsed against me, sobbing with what might have been relief or grief or some combination of both. I held her, awkwardly unused to physical affection with this woman who had been a stranger despite sharing my blood. When she finally pulled back, her expression had changed. There was something else she needed to tell me. "There's one more thing you need to know," she whispered. "Mom and Dad, they're not just cruel. They're terrified. They have been for years, ever since Eleanor started asking questions about the past." She took a shaky breath. "Mom never stopped loving your father, Camille. James Porter. She never stopped loving him, and every time she looks at you, she sees the life she could have had." The words hung in the air between us, reshaping everything I thought I understood about my mother. Patricia Stone, the ice queen who had dismissed my potential death as an inconvenience, who had spent 36 years making me feel worthless and unwanted. She had been in love with my father this entire time. The cruelty that had defined my childhood suddenly had a new dimension, a twisted logic that made it somehow both more understandable and more horrifying. "How do you know this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clarissa glanced around the cemetery nervously before continuing, as if even the dead might report our conversation back to our parents. "I found out by accident about 3 years ago. Mom was in the hospital for a minor procedure, and Dad asked me to get some documents from her bedroom safe. The combination was her anniversary date. How's that for irony?" She laughed bitterly. "I found the usual things: jewelry, passports, insurance papers. But there was also a locked drawer inside the safe, one I'd never noticed before. I shouldn't have opened it, I know that, but something made me curious." She paused, gathering herself for what came next. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to James Porter, all unsent. Some were years old, the paper yellowed and brittle. Others were recent, written on Mom's personal stationery. "She writes to him every year on your birthday, Camille. Every single year she writes a letter to the man she loved, telling him about the daughter they share, about how much she misses him, about how sorry she is for the choice she was forced to make." I tried to reconcile this image with the woman I knew, the cold, calculating socialite who had hung up on a hospital while I was bleeding to death. The mother who had told me I was too fat at 9 years old, too plain at 12, too disappointing at every age thereafter. How could someone who wrote secret love letters be the same person who had made my childhood a wasteland of criticism and neglect? "She's never stopped loving him," Clarissa said quietly. "All these years, all the country club lunches and charity galas and perfect dinner parties, she's been playing a role. The woman everyone sees isn't who she really is. It's just a character she performs because Eleanor took away her choice to be anything else." The mention of our grandmother sent a complicated wave of emotion through me. Eleanor, who had loved me in ways my parents never did. Eleanor, who had also orchestrated the lie that separated my mother from the man she loved, that sentenced me to a childhood of rejection and pain. The same woman who had tried to make amends in her final years had also set this entire tragedy in motion decades ago. Mom was 22 when Eleanor forced her to end things with James, Clarissa continued. Barely older than a child herself. She didn't have money of her own, didn't have anywhere to go. Eleanor controlled everything: the family finances, the social connections, even the house Mom grew up in. When Eleanor said marry Richard Stone or lose everything, Mom didn't see another option. I thought about my mother at 22, pregnant and terrified, watching the man she loved disappear from her life because her own mother valued reputation over her daughter's happiness. It didn't excuse anything she had done to me. Nothing could excuse that. But it opened a window into the machinery of her cruelty, showed me the gears and levers that had been turning beneath the surface all along. Patricia hadn't been born cruel. She had been broken, twisted by circumstances she couldn't control, trapped in a life she never wanted with a man she never loved. And every time she looked at me, she saw the evidence of her loss. James's eyes in my face, James's stubbornness in my personality, James's existence haunting her through the daughter she had been forced to raise in his absence. She couldn't punish Eleanor, who held all the power. She couldn't punish herself because she was already living the punishment of her choices. So she punished me instead, the innocent reminder of everything that had been taken from her. She transferred her grief and resentment onto a child who had done nothing wrong except be born. "It doesn't excuse what she did to me," I said, and the words came out firm despite the confusion churning inside me. "Nothing excuses 36 years of abuse." "No," Clarissa agreed. "It doesn't, but it explains the pattern, doesn't it?" Eleanor pressured Mom. "Mom took it out on us. Now Mom and Dad are doing the same thing to Lily." She met my eyes with a clarity I had never seen in her before. "It's a cycle, Camille. Generational trauma passed down like a poisoned inheritance. Everyone hurting the next person in line because they don't know how to heal their own wounds." I thought about Lily, 8 years old and already learning to hate her body. About the invisible scars she would carry into adulthood if nothing changed. About the person she might become if she spent the next decade being molded by the same forces that had shaped her mother and her aunts. Breaking this cycle wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about making my parents pay for what they had done, though that satisfaction would be welcome. It was about liberation, cutting the thread of pain that had woven through 3 generations of women in my family, making sure it ended here with us. "Does Mom know?" I asked suddenly. "Does she know that James is still alive? Does she know he's been trying to find me?" Clarissa's face went pale, her expression shifting to something that looked almost like fear. "That's exactly what they're afraid of," she said. "Mom and Dad both. Finding out that Eleanor told James the truth before she died, that he knows you exist, that he's been looking for you, it terrified them. If you and James reconnect, if he comes back into your life and Mom has to face him again after all these years." She shook her head slowly. "Mom's entire world falls apart. Everything she built, everything she sacrificed, all the years of pretending to be happy with Dad, it all becomes meaningless. She'd have to face what she gave up, what Eleanor took from her, what she became in the aftermath." The next week passed in a blur of strategy sessions, document review, and careful planning. Ethan transformed the small rental house we had moved into, chosen for its anonymity and its distance from Stone family influence, into something resembling a military command center. Laptops covered every flat surface. Files were organized with meticulous precision, and a whiteboard on the wall mapped out connections between people, money, and corruption that stretched back decades. True to his word, Ethan had reached out to his network of contacts from his years of military service. Marcus Chen, the lawyer he had mentioned, turned out to be a former JAG officer who now specialized in cases involving powerful defendants and vulnerable witnesses. He arrived 2 days after the cemetery meeting with a team of investigators and a reputation for taking on fights that others considered unwinnable. "I've reviewed everything you've sent me," Marcus said during our first strategy session, spreading documents across the dining room table. "The evidence is substantial, but the opposition is formidable. The Stone family has spent decades building relationships with local power structures. They have judges who owe them favors, police officers on their informal payroll, journalists who depend on their advertising dollars. Taking them down means going up against an entire ecosystem designed to protect their interests. I looked at the mountain of evidence we had assembled over the past week. The hospital recordings sat at the center, my mother's cold dismissal, my father's deliberate lie about self-harm. Clarissa had delivered everything she promised, and more years of emails documenting financial manipulation recordings of private conversations that revealed the family's true nature, bank statements showing payments to Officer Daniels and others who had helped maintain the Stone family's pristine public image. Ethan had contributed his own findings surveillance footage from Eleanor's house, showing Daniels entering without authorization phone records proving coordination between my parents and the corrupt officer documentation of the suspiciously rapid closure of my accident investigation. Combined with my grandmother's journals and financial records showing her secret support of James Porter's legal efforts, we had built a comprehensive picture of corruption, abuse, and conspiracy that spanned generations. "Walk me through the actionable charges," I said, forcing myself to focus on facts rather than emotions. Marcus nodded, pulling out a legal pad covered in notes. "First, obstruction of justice. Officer Daniels closed your accident investigation without proper procedure, and we can prove he was compensated by your father for doing so. That's a felony for Daniels and potentially conspiracy charges for your parents." He turned to the next page. "Second, filing false statements. Your father told the hospital you had a history of self-harm, which is demonstrably untrue. That statement was designed to delay your treatment and could have resulted in your death. Given the circumstances, a prosecutor could argue this constitutes attempted manslaughter or worse. The clinical description of what my father had done, reducing it to legal terminology, somehow made it more real. He hadn't just been cruel. He had committed crimes against his own daughter. Third," Marcus continued, "conspiracy to commit fraud. The recordings Clarissa provided show clear evidence that your parents planned to have you declared mentally incompetent in order to seize control of Eleanor's estate. The witnesses they lined up, the psychiatrist they bribed, it's textbook fraud conspiracy. And finally, witness tampering. Your sister's testimony that she was pressured to participate in false statements about your mental state, combined with the threats made to keep her compliant, constitutes illegal interference with potential legal proceedings." I absorbed the information watching Marcus's team organize documents into evidence packets that would eventually be presented to prosecutors and judges far removed from Stone family influence. Each file represented a piece of the machine that had tried to destroy me. Each document was a weapon I had never known I could wield. For 36 years, I had been powerless in my own family. I had been the unwanted child, the scapegoat, the target of casual cruelty that everyone around me pretended not to notice. I had built a life helping other victims find their voices, never fully recognizing that I had been silenced myself, never believing that I had the right or the ability to fight back against the people who had hurt me. But sitting in that rented house surrounded by evidence of crimes committed against me and others, I felt something shift inside my chest. It wasn't anger, though. Anger was certainly there. It wasn't even satisfaction at the prospect of my parents facing consequences for their actions. It was power, genuine, tangible power that I had earned through survival and claimed through the courage to speak the truth. I could destroy them. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I had the evidence, the legal team, the witnesses. I could take everything they valued, their reputation, their freedom, their control, and watch it crumble around them. But even as that dark satisfaction flickered through me, I forced myself to remember why I was doing this. Not for vengeance, however much my wounded inner child craved it. I was doing this for Lily, who still had a chance to grow up free from the toxic patterns that had poisoned 3 generations. For Clarissa, who had finally found the courage to break free from her gilded cage. For James Porter, who had lost 36 years with his daughter because of lies and manipulation. And yes, for myself, for the little girl who had been told she was worthless, who had spent decades believing it, who deserved to finally hear the truth acknowledged by the world. Justice, not revenge. Accountability, not cruelty. Those had to be my guideposts, or I risked becoming exactly what I was fighting against. My phone rang, shattering the focused silence of the room. Marcus glanced at the caller ID and answered, his expression professional and composed. But as he listened, I watched his face change, a tightening around the eyes, a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "Understood," he said finally. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour." He ended the call and turned to face the room, his expression grim. "The Stone family just hired Peterson and Associates," he said. "They're the biggest PR crisis management firm in the state, the same people who rehabilitated Senator Morrison after his scandal. According to my source, they're preparing to go public with their own narrative within 48 hours. My stomach dropped. What kind of narrative? The kind that paints you as a mentally unstable woman attacking her loving family for money and attention. Marcus began gathering his documents with renewed urgency. We need to move fast. If they control the story first, everything we've built becomes much harder to prove in the court of public opinion. We weren't fast enough. The Stone family's media blitz launched before we could file a single document, before we could get our evidence in front of prosecutors, before we could do anything except watch as my parents performed the roles of their lives on every local news channel that would have them. I stood in the rental house living room staring at the television as my mother's face filled the screen. She was seated on an elegant sofa in what I recognized as the formal sitting room of my childhood home, tissues clutched delicately in one manicured hand, my father's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. The interviewer, a woman whose sympathetic expression suggested she had already chosen. Her side leaned forward with practiced concern. "This must be incredibly difficult for you both," the interviewer said, "to have your own daughter make these kinds of accusations publicly." My mother dabbed at her eyes with the tissue, and even through the television screen I could see the calculation behind her tears. This was a woman who had perfected the art of public emotion, who knew exactly how to appear vulnerable while remaining completely in control. "Camille has always been troubled," she said, her voice catching with perfectly manufactured grief. "From the time she was a little girl, she struggled with emotional problems. We tried everything, therapy, medication, special programs. We gave her every advantage, every opportunity, but she pushed us away." My father nodded solemnly, his expression radiating dignified sorrow. "We've spent years hoping she would get better, praying that she would come home and be part of our family again. These accusations she's making, they break our hearts. They're not true, not a single one of them. But we understand that she's sick, that she needs help we can't give her." The interviewer turned to face the camera, addressing the audience directly. "The Stone family has been a pillar of this community for generations, known for their charitable work and civic involvement. Now they find themselves at the center of a family drama that has captured national attention." I wanted to scream. I wanted to put my fist through the screen to call the station and demand equal time to do something that would shatter the careful illusion my parents were constructing. But all I could do was stand there watching them weaponize my suffering, transform my truth into evidence of my supposed mental illness. The interview continued for another 10 excruciating minutes. My parents painted a picture of a troubled child who had grown into a disturbed woman, someone who had fabricated accusations for attention and money, who had turned against the family that loved her because of jealousy and mental instability. They mentioned my work as a social worker, with a tone of condescending pity, suggesting that I had chosen the field because of my own unresolved issues rather than genuine compassion for others. By the time the segment ended, social media had already erupted. Ethan pulled up the feeds on his laptop, and I watched in real time as public opinion divided into warring camps. Some voices rose in my defense, people who recognized the pattern of narcissistic parents, who had experienced similar family dynamics, who saw through the polished performance to the manipulation underneath. The hashtag Justice for Camille began trending, accompanied by messages of support and solidarity. But the attacks were equally fierce, equally viral. Another ungrateful daughter trying to cash in on family drama. If her parents were really that bad, why didn't she speak up years ago? Rich people problems must be nice to have inheritance money to fight over. She's obviously mentally ill, just like they said. Sad that the media is giving her a platform. Every cruel comment felt like a knife sliding between my ribs, finding wounds I thought had healed and tearing them open again. Someone had dug up my college records and was speculating about grades I had struggled to earn while working 2 jobs. Someone else had found old photos and was analyzing my appearance for signs of the eating disorder I had never publicly discussed. A former coworker I barely remembered had given an interview describing me as intense and difficult to work with. Every piece of my life was being excavated, examined, twisted into evidence that supported my parents' narrative. I sat down heavily on the couch, the weight of the public assault pressing down on me like a physical force. This was what they did to people who challenged them. This was why no one had ever stood up to the Stone family before. They didn't just fight back, they destroyed. They took everything you were and everything you had been and turned it into ammunition against you. "I can't do this," I whispered, hating the weakness in my voice but unable to stop it. "They're going to win. They always win." Ethan sat beside me, his presence solid and steady in the chaos. "They're scared," he said quietly. "That's why they're attacking so hard so fast. Scared people make mistakes, Camille. They overreach. They get sloppy. We just need to hold on long enough for them to make theirs." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that justice would prevail, that truth would triumph over money and influence and decades of carefully cultivated image. But watching my parents perform their victimhood on national television, watching the public lap up their lies like hungry dogs, I felt my faith wavering. My phone rang and I answered without checking the caller ID, too exhausted to care who it might be. "Camille!" Clarissa's voice was barely audible, strangled with fear. "They know I've been talking to you. Someone saw us at the cemetery, or maybe they tracked my phone, I don't know. But they know." I sat up straight, adrenaline cutting through my despair. What happened? "They're forcing me to do a television interview tomorrow morning. I'm supposed to confirm everything they said about you, that you're unstable, that you're lying, that they're the real victims." Clarissa was crying now, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "If I don't do it, if I don't say exactly what they want, they're threatening to sue for custody of Lily. They have lawyers, Camille. They have judges who owe them favors. They could actually take my daughter." The fear in her voice was genuine, primal, the terror of a mother facing the loss of her child. I thought about Lily, about sad eyes and skipped dinners and a little girl learning to hate her own body. I thought about the cycle we were trying to break, about all the sacrifices that would mean nothing if we faltered now. "Don't do what they say," I said, my voice steadying with renewed purpose. "Do what's right. Tell the truth on that interview tomorrow, Clarissa. Tell everyone what they really are. But Lily, trust me, by tomorrow night they won't have power over any of us anymore." I watched the broadcast from a hotel room across town, surrounded by Ethan Marcus and a small army of legal staff ready to spring into action the moment the interview concluded. The television screen showed the familiar studio where my parents had performed their victimhood just 24 hours earlier, now reconfigured for what was being promoted as an exclusive family interview, the Stone family's chance to present a united front against their troubled daughter's accusations. My parents sat on one side of the curved sofa, perfectly positioned to project parental dignity and wounded grace. My mother wore a soft blue dress that photographed beautifully, her makeup subtly designed to make her look tired but brave. My father had chosen a conservative suit, his expression one of stern but loving patience. They looked exactly like what they wanted the world to see, devoted parents struggling to cope with a mentally ill child's public betrayal. Clarissa entered the frame and took her seat beside them, and I held my breath. She was dressed in her usual polished style, every hair in place, her makeup camera ready. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like the perfect daughter preparing to defend her perfect family. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her microphone. I could see the war being fought behind her carefully composed expression. The interviewer, the same sympathetic woman from yesterday, began with the expected softball questions. How was the family holding up? How did they feel about the public attention? What message did they want to send to the viewers watching at home? My parents answered with practiced ease, hitting all the notes their PR team had rehearsed. Family unity, love for their troubled daughter, hope that she would get the help she needed. Each response was designed to reinforce the narrative they had constructed to cement their position as the victims of an unstable woman's vendetta. Then the interviewer turned to Clarissa. "You and Camille were close growing up, weren't you? This must be especially painful for you." I watched my sister's face on the screen, searching for any indication of what she was about to do. For a moment, she seemed frozen, caught between the script she had been given and the truth that was burning to get out. Her eyes flicked briefly toward our mother, then away. "Camille and I weren't close," Clarissa said, her voice mechanical. "Our parents gave us every opportunity, every advantage, but Camille always struggled. She was jealous of me, resentful of our family's success. She stopped. On screen, I could see the exact moment something shifted in her eyes. A hardening, a decision being made in real time. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was completely different. Stronger, clearer, real. "I'm not here to defend my parents." The words fell into the studio like stones into still water. My mother's composed expression flickered with the first hints of alarm. My father leaned forward slightly as if preparing to intervene. Clarissa turned to face the camera, directly ignoring the interviewer, ignoring our parents, speaking straight to the millions of people watching at home. "I'm here to tell the truth I should have told years ago." "Clarissa." My mother's voice carried a warning edge beneath its maternal concern. "Sweetheart, you're upset. Maybe we should take a break." My parents emotionally abused both of their daughters for decades. Clarissa spoke over our mother's interruption, her words gaining momentum like an avalanche building strength as it descended. "They criticized us, controlled us, pitted us against each other. They made us believe we were worthless unless we performed perfection for their approval. They destroyed our self-esteem, our relationship with each other, our ability to trust anyone, including ourselves." "That's enough." My father's voice cracked like a whip, his dignified facade crumbling to reveal the authoritarian beneath. "Clarissa, stop this immediately." But Clarissa was beyond their control now, beyond their threats, beyond the cage they had built around her entire life. When Camille was dying after her car accident, my parents refused to authorize the surgery that would save her life. They told the hospital she had a history of self-harm, a lie designed to delay treatment. They wanted her dead because dead she couldn't inherit our grandmother's estate. The interviewer's mouth had fallen open. The camera operators exchanged stunned glances. This was not the carefully choreographed family reunion the network had been promised. "They bribed a police officer to close the accident investigation," Clarissa continued, tears streaming down her face now, but her voice remaining steady. "They hired a psychiatrist to provide a fake evaluation that would have had Camille declared mentally incompetent. They planned every detail of how to steal her inheritance and destroy her credibility if she ever tried to fight back." "You ungrateful—" My mother lunged toward Clarissa, her mask of maternal concern completely gone, replaced by something feral and desperate. A production assistant rushed in to separate them, while the camera kept rolling, capturing every moment of the Stone family's public disintegration. Clarissa stood straightening her dress with shaking hands and delivered her final statement directly to the lens. "I was their weapon against my sister for 33 years. I was the good daughter, the obedient one, the one who performed whatever role they demanded in exchange for conditional love that was never really love at all. I'm done. I'm choosing truth over performance. I'm choosing my sister over my cage. And I'm choosing to protect my daughter from becoming the next victim of this family's poison." The studio had gone completely silent except for the hum of equipment and my mother's ragged breathing. Richard Stone sat frozen on the sofa, his face drained of all color, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him in real time. The interviewer seemed to have forgotten she was on live television, staring at the scene before her with undisguised shock. And then my mother spoke, her voice low and venomous, clearly audible despite the chaos around her. She looked directly at the camera at me, though she couldn't see me, and at Clarissa standing defiant before her. "You've destroyed everything," Patricia Stone said, and there was nothing left of the grieving mother she had played so convincingly. Only hatred remained pure and undisguised. "Both of you, and you'll regret this for the rest of your lives." The broadcast ended in chaos, but the real storm was just beginning. Within hours, Clarissa's confession had spread across every platform imaginable, shared and reshared by millions of people who recognized something true in her trembling voice and tear-streaked face. The hashtag #StonesFamilyLies began trending locally, then regionally, then nationally, as the story captured the attention of news outlets hungry for exactly this kind of dramatic family implosion. I watched from the hotel room as the empire my parents had spent decades building collapsed in real time. Former friends who had attended their parties and praised their generosity rushed to distance themselves, issuing carefully worded statements expressing shock and disappointment. Business partners who had benefited from Stone family connections suddenly remembered urgent commitments elsewhere. The charity board my mother had chaired for 15 years called an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her, citing conduct unbecoming of a representative of their organization. News crews descended on my hometown like locusts, interviewing anyone willing to speak about the family they thought they knew. Former housekeepers emerged with stories of my mother's cruelty behind closed doors. Old teachers remembered Clarissa's perfectionism and my withdrawal with new troubling context. Neighbors who had smiled at the Stone family for years now recalled incidents they had dismissed at the time, shouting matches heard through windows, a little girl sitting alone on the porch while a party continued inside, the strange absence of joy in what should have been a happy home. The legal consequences followed with gratifying speed. Marcus had filed our evidence with state prosecutors the moment Clarissa's interview concluded, and they moved with an urgency that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to investigate a family that had long been suspected of corruption but never exposed. Officer Daniels was suspended within 24 hours, his badge and gun confiscated, pending a formal review of his conduct. The accident investigation was reopened this time by investigators from outside the county who had no connection to Stone family influence. My parents were served with subpoenas 3 days after the broadcast. I wasn't there to see it, but Ethan's contacts provided detailed accounts. My mother's screaming fury, my father's cold threats, the fleet of lawyers that descended on their home like vultures circling a dying animal. A judge I had never met from a district far removed from Stone family reach issued a temporary protective order keeping my parents away from me, Clarissa, and most importantly, Lily. Their bank accounts were frozen while forensic accountants examined decades of financial records for evidence of the fraud we had alleged. Clarissa and Lily moved into the hotel with me, 3 generations of Stone women finally united against the poison that had infected our family for so long. I watched my niece gradually emerge from her shell over those first few days, saw the tension leave her small shoulders as she realized that the grandparents who had made her feel worthless would no longer have access to her. She smiled more. She ate full meals without apologizing. She asked questions about things that interested her without first checking to see if her curiosity was acceptable. These were small victories, but they felt enormous. My phone became a constant stream of notifications, messages from strangers who had watched Clarissa's confession and recognized their own families in her words. Some wrote long, detailed accounts of their own experiences with narcissistic parents, abusive households, the particular pain of being unloved by the people who were supposed to protect you. Others sent brief messages of support, just a few words acknowledging that my pain was real and my courage mattered. Thank you for speaking up. I thought I was alone. I watched your sister's interview and cried for 3 hours. Everything she described happened in my family too. You gave me the courage to finally tell my own story. My mother hasn't spoken to me in a year, but I'm free. I'm a therapist, And I'm already seeing clients who were inspired by your case to confront their own family trauma. What you did matters more than you know. I read every message, even the painful ones, even the ones that brought tears streaming down my face. I realized that what had started as my personal nightmare had become something larger, a beacon for others who had suffered in silence, who had been told they were the problem, who had spent years wondering what they had done wrong to deserve their family's cruelty. My pain had been transformed into something meaningful, not erased, not forgotten, but given purpose. The cycle I was breaking wasn't just my family's. It was a pattern that existed in millions of homes, a form of abuse that hid behind closed doors and family photos, and the assumption that parents always loved their children. By speaking the truth about what had happened to me, I had given permission for others to speak their truths too. I had torn a hole in the wall of silence that protected abusers and isolated victims, and through that hole, light was beginning to pour. I was sitting on the hotel balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold when Ethan found me. He had been coordinating with Marcus all day, managing the legal firestorm that my parents were trying desperately to contain, but something in his expression now was different. Softer. Almost nervous. "There's someone who wants to see you," he said, his voice gentle in a way that made my heart skip. "He's been watching everything that happened. The interview, the news coverage, all of it. He wanted to reach out sooner, but I asked him to wait until things settled down a little." I knew who he meant before he said the name. I had known this moment was coming ever since Eleanor's letter, ever since I learned that my biological father had spent 5 years waiting for the chance to meet me. But knowing it was coming and being ready for it were two very different things. "He's so proud of you, Camille," Ethan smiled, and I saw the love he had for the man who had raised him reflected in his eyes. "He's watched you fight for yourself, stand up against everything that was trying to destroy you. He says you're exactly who he always hoped you would be." My hands were trembling. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "He's downstairs," Ethan said softly. "He'd like to finally meet his daughter." I asked Ethan for 1 hour before meeting James. There was something I needed to do first, a final door I needed to close before I could fully open myself to the new life waiting for me. He understood without requiring explanation, and 30 minutes later I stood at the entrance to the Stone family mansion for what I knew would be the last time. The house looked different now. The manicured hedges that had always seemed so imposing were just plants. The columns flanking the front door were just architecture. The weight of intimidation that had pressed down on me every time I approached this place had evaporated, replaced by something closer to pity. This wasn't a castle anymore. It was a mausoleum, a monument to values that had crumbled to dust the moment Clarissa spoke the truth on national television. A security guard hired by the court confirmed my identity and escorted me inside. My parents were confined to their home pending trial. Their passports seized their movements, monitored. The grand rooms I remembered as showcases of wealth and status now felt hollow, staged sets for a performance no one was watching anymore. I found them in the sitting room, where they had given their interview just days ago. My mother sat rigid in a wing-back chair, her appearance still impeccable, but her eyes burning with hatred. My father stood by the window, his back to me, his shoulders carrying a defeat he would never admit. "Come to gloat." Patricia's voice dripped with venom. "To see what you've destroyed." I came for closure. I remained standing, keeping distance between us. "I didn't come for revenge, and I didn't come for an apology. I know you're not capable of one." Richard turned from the window, and I saw something in his face I had never seen before. The mask completely gone, revealing the petty, bitter man who had resented my existence since the day I was born. "I raised you for 36 years, he said. "Knowing you weren't mine. Knowing every time I looked at you that you were proof of your mother's betrayal. Doesn't that count for something? You raised me with contempt and cold silence?" I replied, surprised by how steady my voice remained. "You punished a child for circumstances she didn't create. That's not parenting. That's cruelty wearing a father's face." Patricia rose from her chair, her composure cracking. I did the best I could. You don't understand the pressure I was under. My mother controlled everything. I had no choices. You had choices. I met her eyes without flinching. You could have loved me anyway. You could have separated your pain from your parenting. Instead, you made me the target of everything you couldn't face in yourself. That wasn't pressure. That was choice. Silence fell over the room, heavy and final. I looked at these two people who had shaped so much of my life through their rejection, their manipulation, their failure to be the parents I needed. I had spent 36 years trying to earn their love, contorting myself into shapes I thought they might approve of, blaming myself for their inability to see my worth. That was over now. I didn't come here expecting anything from you, I said, moving toward the door. I came to tell you that I'm done. Not done with anger, I'll probably carry some of that forever, but done with needing anything from you. Done waiting for love you were never going to give. Done trying to prove I deserved a place in a family that never wanted me. I paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the people who had given me life, but never truly let me live it. I have a real father who wanted me before he even knew I existed. I have a sister who chose me over everything she was taught to value. I have a niece who needs me to show her that the cycle can be broken. I'm building a family now, a real one based on love instead of obligation. You're not part of that story anymore. I walked out without waiting for a response. Ethan was leaning against the car in the driveway, the afternoon sun catching the silver at his temples. He straightened when he saw me, his expression questioning, but patient. He's ready, Ethan said softly. Are you? The drive took us away from town, past the manicured suburbs, and into the countryside where the houses grew smaller and the spaces between them wider. Ethan navigated the winding roads with the ease of someone who had made this journey many times before, and I watched the landscape change outside my window, feeling my heart beat faster with each passing mile. We turned onto a gravel driveway that wound through a stand of old-growth trees, and then I saw it, a modest house with a wraparound porch, weathered but well-maintained, the kind of home that spoke of simple values and careful stewardship. Flower boxes lined the railing, filled with late-season blooms in shades of yellow and gold. A rocking chair sat empty near the front door waiting, and on the porch steps stood a man. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired and weathered by years of service and grief and quiet hope. He wore simple clothes, khaki pants, a blue flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, and his posture carried the straight-backed dignity of someone who had spent decades in uniform. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath, that made my hands fly to my mouth to contain the sob rising in my chest. They were my eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same depth of feeling that I had seen in my own reflection for 36 years, without understanding where they came from. James Porter stood as the car approached, and I could see from here that his hands were trembling. 5 years he had waited for this moment. 5 years of knowing I existed, of being forbidden from reaching me, of watching from a distance, while Ethan kept him informed of my life. 5 years of rehearsing what he would say when we finally met. I stepped out of the car on legs that felt uncertain, and all those rehearsed words seemed to fall away from both of us. We stood there, father and daughter, separated by 20 feet of gravel driveway and 36 years of stolen time. Camille! His voice broke on my name, cracked open with emotion he couldn't contain. I thought I lost you before I ever had you. They told me you were dead. I believed them for 36 years. Tears were streaming down his weathered face, now cutting rivers through the landscape of his grief. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm so sorry I didn't fight harder to find the truth. I moved toward him slowly, each step carrying the weight of every question I had never been able to ask, every moment of longing for a father who would look at me with love instead of resentment. I saw myself in the shape of his chin, in the way he held his shoulders, in the nervous habit of rubbing his thumb against his forefinger that I recognized because I did the same thing. This was where I came from. This was the love that had been stolen from me before I could remember it existed. When I reached him, when I stepped into his arms for the first time in my life, 36 years of grief and hope collided in a single embrace. He held me like something precious, something he had mourned and dreamed of and never stopped believing might somehow return to him. And I held him back, this stranger who was also my blood, this father I had never known I was missing. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be wanted. Not for what I could perform or achieve or become, but simply for existing. Simply for being his daughter. James pulled back eventually, his face wet with tears that matched my own. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn key, brass old-fashioned attached to a faded ribbon. "Your grandmother gave me this before she died," he said, pressing it into my palm. "She said it opened something she left for you, something she wanted you to have when you finally found your way home." The key fit perfectly into the lock of a small cottage set back in the trees behind James's house. I hadn't noticed it during our arrival, hidden as it was by a curtain of old oaks, but now it stood before me like a secret finally revealed. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, and I stepped into a space that made my breath catch in my throat. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains onto walls covered with photographs of me. School pictures James must have obtained, somehow candid shots from a distance, newspaper clippings about my work with abuse survivors. A timeline of my life assembled with painstaking care by a father who had been told his daughter was dead but had never stopped hoping. Above the fireplace hung a carved wooden sign, its letters shaped with obvious love. "For my daughter Camille whenever she finds her way home." James had built this cottage years ago, he explained through tears. A place for the daughter he mourned, kept ready for a reunion he refused to stop believing in. And my grandmother, in her final act of redemption, had given him the key to give to me. One last gift from a woman who had caused immeasurable harm, but spent her dying years trying to make it right. That was a year ago. Now I stand on the porch of this cottage that has become my second home, watching the autumn leaves drift down through the evening air. So much has changed since that first day. The legal proceedings concluded 6 months ago. Richard and Patricia Stone received suspended sentences, substantial financial penalties, and permanent restraining orders that ensure they will never again have access to me, Clarissa, or Lily. Their social standing evaporated completely. Their business connections severed, their carefully constructed image revealed as the hollow facade it always was. Officer Daniels lost his badge and faces his own criminal charges. The Stone family name, once synonymous with success and respectability in this town, now serves as a cautionary tale about the poison that can hide behind perfect photographs. Clarissa is in therapy now, slowly unpacking 33 years of conditioning and control. She's found an apartment near mine in Chicago, determined to build a life that isn't defined by performance and approval. She still struggles, we both do. But she's learning to define herself by her own values, rather than the impossible standards our parents imposed. Most importantly, she has full custody of Lily, and the courts have made it clear that Richard and Patricia Stone will never have unsupervised access to their granddaughter again. The door behind me opens, and Ethan steps onto the porch, handing me a cup of tea before settling into the chair beside mine. We don't need to define what we are to each other, protector and protected friends, perhaps something more that's still unfolding. What matters is that he's here, steady and present, part of the family I'm building from the ashes of the one that tried to destroy me. Through the window I can see Lily helping James make cookies in the cottage kitchen. Her laughter drifts out into the evening air, real laughter, free and unself-conscious. The sound of a child who is finally learning that she doesn't have to earn love through perfection. James moves around her with patient joy, teaching her to measure flour, letting her lick the spoon, being the grandfather she deserves. 3 generations connected by choice, rather than obligation, healing together from wounds we didn't inflict on each other. I look up at the darkening sky where the first stars are beginning to emerge. Somewhere beyond that vast expanse, I imagine my grandmother watching. Eleanor, who set so much tragedy in motion, but spent her final years trying to redirect its course. "You were wrong about so many things," I whisper to the evening air. You hurt people I love, including me. But you spent your last years trying to make it right. You gave me Ethan. You gave me James. You gave me the truth, even though it came too late. I pause, feeling something loosen in my chest. I forgive you. And I finally found my way home. Behind me, Lily calls out that the cookies are ready. James's warm laughter follows. Ethan's hand finds mine in the darkness. I turn away from the sky and walk toward the light spilling from the cottage windows toward the family that chose me, and the family I chose in return. The door closes gently behind me. Not an ending. A beginning. And that's where Camille's story ends, not with revenge, but with something far more powerful: freedom. Freedom from the family that tried to destroy her. Freedom from the lies that shaped her entire life. Freedom to finally be loved by a father who never stopped hoping she would find her way home. But here's what I want you to take away from this story. Camille spent 36 years believing she was the problem. She tried harder, demanded less, made herself smaller, all hoping to earn love from people who had decided before she was even born that she would never deserve it. And maybe some of you watching right now know exactly what that feels like. Maybe you've spent years wondering what you did wrong, why your family treats you differently, why love that should be unconditional always seems to come with strings attached. If that's you, I want you to hear this. It was never your fault. Just like it was never Camille's fault. Some people are incapable of giving love not because of anything you did or didn't do, but because of their own brokenness, their own choices, their own failures. You are not responsible for healing people who refuse to acknowledge they're wounded. You are not obligated to keep offering yourself up to people who only know how to take. The cycle can be broken. Camille proved that. Clarissa proved that. And little Lily, growing up now in a home filled with real love instead of performance and criticism, she's proof that the next generation doesn't have to inherit the poison of the last. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something like what Camille went through? Have you ever had to choose between your own well-being and the expectations of family members who didn't have your best interests at heart? Drop a comment below and share your story. You might be surprised how many people in this community understand exactly what you've been through. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone can be the first step toward healing. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or remember something important about your own journey, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share stories like this every week, stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the strength to overcome them. Stories about justice, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit. Don't forget to like this video if Camille's courage inspired you. Share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone. And most importantly, thank you for being here, for listening, for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be loved for who you are, not who someone else demands you become. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.